Imagine someone asks, "What's 2 plus 2?" Instantly you know the answer. No effort, no pause. Now imagine they ask, "What's 17 times 24?" Suddenly your mind slows. You frown, focus, maybe even reach for a calculator. Same brain, two very different speeds. This is where Daniel Kahneman begins his journey in thinking, fast and slow. Inside each of us are two systems of thought. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive. It reacts in a heartbeat, spotting faces, finishing sentences, jumping to conclusions. It's the voice of instinct, efficient but error-prone. System 2 is slower, deliberate, logical. It crunches numbers, weighs evidence, and double-checks. It's powerful, but lazy, stepping in only when System 1 struggles. Most of the time, System 1 runs the show, and that's both useful and dangerous. It helps us navigate daily life, but it also tricks us with biases, illusions, and overconfidence. This book is a tour through those traps. Why do we fear rare risks, yet ignore common ones? Why do we cling to losses longer than we celebrate gains? Why do we think we knew it all along after the fact? Why do our memories of happiness differ from our actual experiences? Kahneman doesn't just explain these quirks. He shows how they shape our decisions in business, politics, relationships, even the stories we tell about our lives. Once you see these patterns, you'll notice them everywhere. In negotiations, in headlines, in your own choices. You won't become perfectly rational, but you'll become wiser, more aware of how your mind really works. So here's the question. Are you living at the mercy of fast thinking, or are you ready to slow down and see clearly? Welcome to MindSpark, where great books meet powerful ideas. Part 1. Two Systems, Chapter 1. Imagine you're walking down the street on a sunny afternoon. Out of the corner of your eye, you catch a glimpse of something slithering near your feet. Before you even think, your body jolts back. Your heart races, your muscles tighten, your breath quickens. Only a second later do you realize it was just a stick. That instant reaction, that lightning-fast decision, didn't come from slow, careful reasoning. It came from a different part of your mind, the part that acts first and thinks later. This is where Daniel Kahneman begins his journey, with the story of two minds living inside us. He calls them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the quick one, always switched on, scanning the world for danger, patterns, opportunities. It's intuitive, emotional, and fast, sometimes wonderfully so, other times disastrously wrong. System 2, by contrast, is the thinker, the one that takes its time. It weighs evidence, crunches numbers, and solves problems when things get complicated. Let's pause here. Because when I first read this, I thought, well, that makes sense. I've always felt like there are two voices in my head, the quick gut and the slow reason. But what struck me was how Kahneman shows that System 1 is in charge far more often than we realize. It's like the autopilot of our lives. We like to think we're rational creatures, guided by logic, but really, we're constantly nudged, shaped, and even tricked by that faster, impulsive part of our brain. Picture this. You see a face flash by for half a second. You instantly know whether the person looks friendly or threatening. That's System 1 at work. Effortless, automatic. But if I asked you to multiply 37 by 26 in your head, you'd feel the weight of effort, the strain of focusing. That's System 2, groaning awake from its nap, forced to engage. And here's the twist. Because System 2 is lazy, it doesn't want to wake up, it often just accepts whatever story System 1 feeds it. Kahneman gives us this metaphor because he wants us to see how much of our decision-making is built on shortcuts. And those shortcuts, while useful, can lead us astray. Think about snap judgments. You meet someone new, and within seconds, you just know whether you like them. Later, you might build a whole rational explanation for why. But truthfully, your System 1 already made the call, and System 2 simply played defense, inventing reasons to justify it. Personally, when I reflect on my own life, I realize how often I let System 1 drive the car. Buying something impulsively online because it felt right. Making assumptions about a stranger because of how they dressed. Even deciding whether a piece of news sounded true based on the tone, not the evidence. And I think that's what Kahneman wants us to wrestle with, that gap between the mind we believe we use and the one actually steering us. Now, he doesn't say System 1 is bad. In fact, it's crucial. Without it, we wouldn't survive. Imagine if you had to consciously process every step of walking, every word in a conversation, every tiny signal in the environment. You'd be exhausted before breakfast. System 1 saves us, giving us fluency in the world. But when the stakes are high, money, relationships, careers, System 1 can trip us up. It jumps to conclusions, ignores statistics, falls in love with stories rather than facts. Here's where the story turns personal for Kahneman himself. As a psychologist, he spent decades studying how people think, and what shocked him was how predictable our mistakes are. We don't just misjudge randomly, we misjudge systematically. We all share the same blind spots, the same illusions of thinking. And that begins with understanding this two-system model. Think about driving a car. At first, it's a System 2 task. You're careful, deliberate, thinking about mirrors, pedals, signals. Over time, though, it shifts to System 1. You drive almost unconsciously, holding conversations, sipping coffee. But when something unexpected happens, say, a child runs into the road, System 1 reacts instantly. Only after the fact does System 2 step in, analyzing what happened. This dance between the two systems defines almost everything we do. And here's the kicker. Because System 1 is so fast and effortless, we often trust it too much. We let it dictate even when we should call in System 2. That, to me, is the real caution in this chapter. It's not that our intuition is useless, it's that it's incomplete. It's a friend who means well, but sometimes lies to us without realizing it. So, Chapter 1 sets the stage. Kahneman isn't just describing two mental processes. He's inviting us to see ourselves differently, to notice the moments when we're on autopilot, and to question whether the obvious answer is really the right one. It's a humbling realization. Much of the time, we're less rational than we believe. And yet, I find hope in this. Because once you know the story of these two systems, you can start to notice them in action. You can catch yourself before making that impulsive decision. You can slow down, let System 2 do its work, and maybe, just maybe, make choices that reflect not just your instincts, but your best reasoning. This is just the beginning of the journey, but once you've met System 1 and System 2, you'll start to see them everywhere. In every choice, every argument, every snap judgment. Two minds, one person, and a lifetime of learning how to balance them. Chapter 2. Picture this. You're sitting in a quiet cafe, sipping coffee, watching the world go by. Across the room, a man suddenly drops a glass. It shatters with a loud crash. Before you even realize it, your eyes dart toward him, your shoulders tighten, and your pulse spikes. No one had to tell you to look. You didn't sit there weighing the pros and cons of turning your head. You just did it. This automatic shift of attention is what Kahneman explores in Chapter 2. He calls it the work of System 1, the fast, intuitive part of the mind that reacts without effort. It's like a built-in alarm system, scanning constantly, alerting us to sudden changes, potential threats, or anything out of the ordinary. And the fascinating thing? Most of the time you don't even realize it's happening. Think of walking through a crowded street. Your eyes are pulled to a brightly colored sign. Your ears perk up at the sound of your name being called. Your body tenses when a car horn blares too close. None of these responses require you to think. They just happen. This is System 1 doing what it does best, guiding your attention quickly and effortlessly. But here's where it gets interesting. System 1 doesn't just handle attention. It also shapes your impressions, your judgments, and even your memories. When you see a stranger's face, you immediately form an impression. Friendly, suspicious, tired, confident, long before you have time to reflect. That impression feels natural, obvious, undeniable. Yet it's often nothing more than a rough sketch painted by System 1, filled in with shortcuts and stereotypes. Now let me confess something. I used to think my first impressions were always spot on. If I liked someone instantly, I trusted that instinct. If I felt uneasy, I assumed there was a reason. But Kahneman makes you pause and ask, How many of those snap judgments were accurate? And how many were simply illusions created by a brain that wants quick answers? Looking back, I can recall friendships I nearly avoided because of a bad first impression that turned out to be wrong. That was System 1, jumping ahead, while System 2 stayed quiet in the background. One of Kahneman's points here is about effort. System 2, the slow thinker, doesn't like effort. It's lazy. It only shows up when System 1 can't handle something. You don't calculate a tough math problem unless you have to. You don't dissect every sentence in a conversation unless it's critical. Most of the time, System 2 just lets System 1 run the show. That's efficient, sure, but it leaves us vulnerable to errors. Let's do a little mental experiment. Try adding 2 plus 2. Easy, right? That's System 1. Now try multiplying 47 by 68. Suddenly, you feel the strain. Your eyes might squint. Your body leans forward. Your mind narrows its focus. That's System 2 reluctantly clocking in. The difference in effort is dramatic, and once you notice it, you'll start to see how rare it is that System 2 truly engages in everyday life. Another key idea in this chapter is the concept of attention as a limited resource. Think of it like a spotlight. You can shine it brightly on one thing, but when you do, other things fade into darkness. This is why, when you're deeply focused on reading or solving a puzzle, you can miss something obvious happening around you. There's a famous experiment where people were asked to count how many times a basketball was passed. In the middle of the video, a person in a gorilla suit walked across the screen. Half the viewers never noticed it. Why? Because their System 2 was locked onto the counting task, and System 1 didn't flag the gorilla as important enough to break through. To me, this is humbling. It reminds us that our sense of reality is more fragile than we think. We believe we're aware of everything happening around us, but in truth, our attention is selective, easily hijacked, easily fooled. And here's the kicker. Because System 1 is so automatic, you can't just turn it off. You can't stop yourself from noticing a sudden noise or reacting to a flashing light. You can't stop yourself from forming that instant impression of a stranger. The best you can do is to recognize that these reactions are happening, and to question whether they deserve your trust. Kahneman isn't blaming System 1 here. He's showing us how it works, like a survival tool. Without it, we'd be paralyzed, stuck in endless analysis. But with it, we gain speed and instinct at the cost of accuracy. It's like a friend who's always first to speak, sometimes brilliant, sometimes embarrassing, always quick. So, Chapter 2 deepens the story. It's not just that we have two systems, fast and slow. It's that one of them, the fast one, is steering us constantly, pulling our attention, shaping our judgments, and leaving the slower system to play catch-up. Once you see this, you can't unsee it. You start noticing the moments when your mind leaps before you've even thought. And the real challenge? Deciding when to trust that leap and when to slow down. As I think about it, I realize life is a balance between speed and caution, between the instincts that protect us and the reasoning that corrects us. Kahneman wants us to see that balance clearly, because only then can we hope to make better choices. Chapter 3. Imagine this. You're driving home after a long day. You're tired, maybe a little hungry, and you find yourself at a tricky intersection. A pedestrian starts crossing, and you immediately stop. A second later, you glance at your phone buzzing beside you. But as your eyes flick away for just a moment, you feel the car roll forward slightly. Your foot wasn't pressing the brake as firmly as you thought. You slam it back down. That moment, where your focus slipped, where effort gave way to distraction, captures what Kahneman explains in Chapter 3. System 2 is lazy. It only engages when it has to, and even then, it doesn't like to sustain effort for long. He paints a clear picture. Our brains are like energy misers. Thinking deeply takes effort, and our minds prefer to conserve energy whenever possible. So instead of crunching numbers, we rely on shortcuts. Instead of carefully weighing evidence, we trust intuition. And most of the time, this works fine. But sometimes our laziness betrays us. Here's a small example. Kahneman describes a test often given in psychology classes. A bat and a ball cost $1 10 cents in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Almost everyone's System 1 shouts the same answer, 10 cents. It feels obvious, effortless. But if you pause, if you wake up System 2 and do the math, you realize the ball must cost 5 cents, not 10. Because if the ball were 10 cents, the bat would be $1.10, making the total $1.20. The correct answer takes just a sliver of effort, but many people never bother. They trust the quick answer because it feels right. And isn't that just like life? How often do we accept the first story, the first impression, the first solution that pops into our heads, simply because it requires less energy than questioning it? I've caught myself in this trap plenty of times. Buying something online without comparing prices, because the first option seemed fair. Believing a rumor because it matched what I already suspected. Even making a choice at a restaurant, picking the first dish that looked good instead of scanning the whole menu. None of these moments ruined my life, but they reveal a deeper truth. My mind often chooses comfort over accuracy. Kahneman digs deeper into why this happens. He explains that cognitive effort is like a muscle. The more you strain it, the more tired it becomes. This is why, after a long day of hard thinking, people make poorer decisions. They eat junk food, splurge money, or snap at loved ones. Psychologists call this ego depletion, the idea that self-control and rational thinking are limited resources. When we use them up, we default back to the easy, automatic patterns of System 1. Think of students taking an exam. At the start, they might carefully consider each answer. But as time drags on, fatigue sets in. Their brains start cutting corners. They rush, they guess, they lean on intuition rather than reason. That's System 2 retreating, handing the reins back to System 1. Now here's where the story gets fascinating. Kahneman suggests that our reliance on System 1 isn't just laziness, it's a survival strategy. Life is overwhelming. If we tried to calculate everything, we'd freeze. Imagine crossing a street while analyzing the trajectory of every car, the timing of the lights, the angle of the sun, the friction of your shoes. You'd never get across. System 1 handles the flow so we can survive. But when we lean too heavily on it, we risk mistakes. The chapter also shows how effort shapes perception itself. When we're asked to focus intently, our pupils dilate, our heart rate increases, our body literally prepares for strain. But this can't last long. Just like lifting weights, the mind needs rest. This is why multitasking is such a myth. When you split your attention, you're not doubling your effort, you're diluting it. Both tasks suffer. To me, this chapter is both sobering and comforting. Sobering, because it reminds me that I'm not as rational as I'd like to think. Comforting, because it explains why mental fatigue feels so real. It's not weakness, it's biology. Our brains are designed to save energy, even if that means we make sloppy choices sometimes. The lesson, then, isn't to banish System 1 or force System 2 to stay awake all the time. That would be impossible. The lesson is awareness. To recognize the moments when the lazy brain might be leading us astray. To stop and say, hold on, this feels obvious, but is it really? Sometimes all it takes is that pause to let System 2 step in. Kahneman closes this chapter by nudging us toward humility. If even simple math can trip us up, what about bigger questions? Politics, business, relationships. How often do we let easy answers guide us, convincing ourselves they're solid truths? And how much better might our decisions be if we learned to challenge the comfort of the quick response? Chapter 3, then, isn't just about mental effort. It's about the human tendency to avoid it. And once you see this, you'll start noticing it everywhere, in your choices, in your conversations, even in the headlines you read. The mind is a powerful tool, but it's also a master of shortcuts. The real challenge is knowing when to trust the shortcut and when to summon the energy to think a little harder. Chapter 4. Let me tell you a little story. You're at a family gathering, sitting around the dinner table. Suddenly, someone says the word banana. Instantly, your mind sparks. Without effort, you might picture a bright yellow fruit, maybe even smell its sweetness, or hear the voice of a cartoon monkey. You didn't choose to summon those associations. They arrived, uninvited, automatically. This is the magic of associative memory, the star of Chapter 4. Kahneman explains that our brains are like vast networks of connections, where one idea lights up another and another, like fireworks spreading across the night sky. System 1 is the operator here, always ready to trigger these associations at lightning speed. Think about it. You hear the word bread, and your mind might jump to butter. You hear salt, and pepper pops up. You see a stranger frowning, and without thinking, you assume they're upset. These links are effortless, so smooth we rarely notice them happening. But here's where it gets deeper. These associations don't just bring up random ideas, they also shape our mood, behavior, and judgment. If you're shown the word smile, you're more likely to feel positive. If you hear old age, you might unconsciously slow your walking pace. Researchers call this priming, and it's one of the strangest, most powerful quirks of the human mind. I remember once, before giving a talk, I kept telling myself, "You've got this. You're confident. You're ready." And when I walked on stage, I actually felt it. That wasn't magic. It was priming. My brain was linking those words to the state of confidence, nudging my behavior before I even realized it. Kahneman tells us that associative memory is not just fast, it's sticky. Once an idea gets activated, it pulls in related ideas, emotions, even physical reactions. Imagine someone says, "vomit." Immediately your face twists, your stomach tightens, maybe you even feel a faint sense of disgust. That's not reasoned thought. That's System 1, firing off associations, spreading ripples through your body. And sometimes, those ripples mislead us. Suppose you're shown a smiling person in a photograph, then asked whether that person is trustworthy. Chances are, you'll say yes. Not because you've studied their character, but because the smile triggered positive associations. The mind loves coherence. It wants everything to fit together neatly. So System 1 smooths over the gaps with whatever connections feel natural, even if they're false. This reminds me of how easily advertising works on us. Show me a car next to a beautiful beach, with happy people laughing. And suddenly, I feel good about the car. It has nothing to do with the engine or safety ratings. It's all about associative memory linking that product to pleasure. That's why marketers spend billions on imagery and slogans. They're not talking to System 2. They're whispering directly to System 1. But here's the catch. Associative memory is not under our control. We can't stop the connections from forming. We can't help but feel what we feel. What we can do, though, is recognize the process. We can pause and ask, am I judging this person fairly, or just because they smiled? Do I really want this product, or do I just like the music in the commercial? I'll be honest. After learning about this, I started catching myself in weird little moments, like seeing a celebrity endorse something and feeling drawn to it, even though I knew better, or meeting someone and liking them instantly, only to realize later that they reminded me of a childhood friend. My System 1 had been making connections behind the scenes, and I was mistaking those connections for truth. Kahneman calls this the associative machine. It never rests. Day and night, it's weaving links, making predictions, telling stories. This is why one small cue, a word, an image, a sound, can shift our entire perception. The machine wants the world to make sense, and it fills in gaps with whatever's available. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you read the sentence, "The baby cried all night, and the mother..." Before you even finish, your brain has probably filled in, "was tired." That's not in the text, but your mind supplies it automatically. It craves completeness, so it invents connections. And while this keeps life flowing smoothly, it also means we're constantly vulnerable to illusions of coherence. So what's the takeaway? For me, it's humility. Knowing that my brain is wired to connect dots, even when they don't belong, makes me second-guess my certainty. It makes me pause when a judgment feels too easy. And sometimes, that pause is enough to switch on System 2, to ask whether the story my mind has spun is really true. Chapter 4, then, is a reminder that our thoughts aren't as independent as we think. They're woven from countless invisible threads, pulled by words, images, emotions, even smells. To understand ourselves, we have to understand this web. And once you see it, you realize The mind isn't just reacting to the world, it's constantly shaping it, filling it in, making it feel coherent. That's the beauty and the danger of associative memory. It makes life seamless, but it also makes us vulnerable to suggestion, manipulation, and bias. The challenge is not to shut it off. That's impossible. The challenge is to stay aware of the strings being pulled and to decide consciously which ones will follow. Chapter 5. Picture yourself strolling into a bookstore. The lighting is soft, music hums faintly in the background. You walk past a shelf of brightly colored bestsellers, and without realizing it, you feel lighter, more at ease. The books look inviting. The place feels warm. Now imagine the same scene. But this time the lights flicker harshly, the floor creaks, and the air smells musty. Suddenly, the exact same stack of books feels less appealing. Why? The books didn't change. You did. Or more specifically, your cognitive ease did. Chapter 5 is all about this idea that our minds respond differently when things feel easy versus when they feel difficult. Kahneman calls it the mood of cognitive ease. When something feels smooth, familiar, and effortless, we tend to trust it. When something feels hard, strange, or uncertain, we grow suspicious. Think about it. A sentence written in clear, bold font feels more true than the same sentence printed in a faint, blurry typeface. A fact repeated many times feels more reliable than one we hear just once. A familiar tune feels more pleasant than a completely new one. None of these judgments are about logic. They're about ease. And here's where it gets fascinating. When our minds are in a state of ease, we're more likely to be casual, uncritical, and creative. We accept ideas without much resistance. We make snap judgments. We go with the flow. But when we encounter difficulty, when something feels hard to process, our minds slow down. We become more careful, more vigilant, more skeptical. I remember reading an article online years ago, formatted beautifully with short paragraphs and clean fonts. I found myself nodding along, thinking, yes, this makes sense. Then I stumbled onto a second article, making the opposite argument, but it was written in clunky text, with poor spacing and awkward wording. My brain dismissed it almost instantly, not because it was wrong, but because it felt harder to read. That's cognitive ease at work, tricking me into equating fluency with truth. Kahneman explains that this bias shows up everywhere. Politicians repeat slogans endlessly because repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds trust. Advertisers use catchy jingles for the same reason. Even rumors become true when they circulate long enough. System 1, our fast-thinking brain, equates familiarity with safety. If it feels smooth, it must be right. But here's the danger. Cognitive ease is like a warm bath. It relaxes us, but it also lowers our guard. When we're comfortable, we stop questioning. We overlook errors. We fail to notice inconsistencies. And people who know how to create ease, marketers, politicians, influencers, can guide us wherever they want. On the flip side, when we feel cognitive strain, we switch into System 2 mode. We scrutinize. We check details. We catch mistakes. There's a famous experiment where participants solved trick questions either in an easy-to-read font or in a hard-to-read one. Surprisingly, those who got the harder font actually performed better. Why? Because the difficulty forced them to slow down and engage System 2, making fewer careless errors. This makes me wonder. Maybe struggle isn't always bad. Maybe moments of friction, of difficulty, are what keep us honest. I think about times I've written scripts for work. When the words flowed easily, I felt confident. But later, reading them again, I'd spot gaps I had missed. Meanwhile, the drafts that felt like hard labor, the ones I wrestled with, often turned out sharper and clearer. Strain can be a gift, even if it doesn't feel like one. Kahneman also ties cognitive ease to mood. When we're relaxed and happy, we're more likely to trust System 1. We make intuitive leaps, often creative ones. But when we're tense or anxious, we lean on System 2. We check. We double-check. This isn't just theory. It's practical. Think of a courtroom. Would you rather a jury be in a cheerful, easy mood when considering evidence or in a more skeptical, focused one? the answer could change a verdict. The lesson of Chapter 5, at least for me, is twofold. First, I need to be wary of how much ease shapes my sense of truth. Just because something is familiar or smooth doesn't mean it's accurate. And second, I should welcome difficulty from time to time. When a problem feels hard, that's not always a signal to give up. It may be a signal that my mind is actually doing the deeper work. Here's a personal example. Not long ago, I was designing a project logo. The first draft came together quickly, and I loved it. It felt right. But a week later, with fresh eyes, I realized it was generic and forgettable. The design I truly valued was the one I struggled with for hours, adjusting tiny details until they finally clicked. It wasn't easy, but it was stronger. Cognitive ease makes life feel smooth. Cognitive strain makes it real. And Kahneman leaves us with this reminder. If we want to think well, we can't rely only on what feels fluent. Sometimes the truth lies in what makes us pause, squint, and work a little harder. Chapter 6. Imagine you're sitting in a crowded cafe. The clatter of cups, the buzz of chatter, the hum of background music. It all blends together into noise. Suddenly, someone behind you drops a plate. The sharp crash slices through the room, and your head whips around before you even know why. That reflex, that sudden spike of attention, is what Kahneman explores in Chapter 6. Our brains, he says, are built to notice surprises, moments when the world doesn't unfold as expected. This is because System 1, our fast-thinking autopilot, runs on predictions. It constantly generates little expectations, where a ball will land, how a sentence will finish, how a person will behave. Most of the time, these predictions run silently in the background. But when something violates them, a sudden noise, a strange word, an odd behavior, our attention locks in. Think of it like this. Your brain is less a camera recording reality and more a storyteller predicting what comes next. It saves energy by assuming the world will keep following its usual script. And when it doesn't, the system jolts you awake. Here's an everyday example. You're listening to someone say, "The sky is," and before they finish, your mind already whispers blue. If they instead say, "The sky is green," you freeze for a second. Your brain has to catch up, to rewrite the script. That tiny moment of disruption, that's surprise in action. Kahneman explains that this predictive system is crucial for survival. Imagine walking through the forest. Your mind expects rustling leaves to mean wind, but suddenly, the sound feels off. It's heavier, irregular. Your body tenses. Maybe it's an animal. That alertness could save your life. Surprise grabs your focus because it could signal danger or opportunity. But surprise doesn't just grab attention. It reshapes memory. Think about your own life. Do you remember every Tuesday afternoon? Of course not. But you do remember the day you got unexpected news, or the time your car broke down in the middle of nowhere, or that shocking twist in a movie. Surprises etch themselves into memory because they break the pattern. I find this fascinating because it makes me rethink what I call memorable moments. They're not always the grand ones we plan for. Often, they're the little shocks, the deviations from routine. The time a stranger said something unexpectedly kind. The time the weather turned wild out of nowhere. The brain stores them because they felt out of place. Now, here's the catch. Because System 1 is always hunting for coherence, it doesn't just register surprises, it explains them. It's like a compulsive storyteller. When something unexpected happens, System 1 immediately weaves it into a story that feels smooth and logical, even if the truth is more complicated. For example, imagine a friend who's usually punctual suddenly arrives late. Instantly, your mind generates reasons. Traffic, oversleeping, maybe they're upset with you. Whether or not any of those are true doesn't matter in that moment. The brain craves an explanation, so it invents one. And once it does, System 2 rarely bothers to fact-check. This tendency can be comforting. We like the world to make sense, but it can also mislead us. Surprises get absorbed into neat little narratives, and we forget how shocking they actually felt in the moment. Afterward, the story seems obvious. Of course she was late. She always struggles with time. Or, of course the company failed. The signs were there. In hindsight, the surprise fades, and coherence takes its place. For me, this realization is humbling. It means the stories I tell myself about the past aren't just reflections of what happened. They're reconstructions, smoothed out by System 1. The raw shock, the confusion, the uncertainty, all of that gets edited away. Which makes me wonder, how many times have I convinced myself something was predictable only because I already know the ending? Kahneman's point is sharp. The mind isn't just a passive observer. It's a prediction engine, constantly building expectations, reacting to violations, and then rewriting the story to restore order. And because this process happens so quickly, we rarely notice it. We just accept the story as truth. So what's the takeaway from Chapter 6? For me, it's this. When life surprises you, pause. Notice the shock before your brain explains it away. Don't rush to accept the first story your mind offers, because that story, smooth as it feels, may be more about restoring comfort than capturing reality. I think about moments in my own life when surprises turned into turning points. Times I lost opportunities I thought were certain. Times I gained chances I never saw coming. In each case, my brain quickly spun a narrative. This happened because... But in truth, life is messier than those neat explanations. Recognizing that gives me a little more humility, a little more patience with uncertainty. Chapter 6 reminds us that we live in a world of expectations, and that it's the cracks, the surprises, that shape our attention, our memory, and our stories. The next time something unexpected jolts you, maybe don't rush to explain it away. Sit with the surprise. Let it remind you that the world is bigger, stranger, and less predictable than your mind's neat little script. Chapter 7. Imagine you're sitting in a park, watching people pass by. A man in a sharp suit strides confidently, talking into his phone. You instantly think, successful businessman. A teenager with messy hair and headphones shuffles past. You label him carefree student. None of this takes effort. The judgments pop into your head. Neat little stories about strangers you know nothing about. This is what Kahneman unpacks in Chapter 7. System 1 is a machine for jumping to conclusions. It hates uncertainty, so it fills the gaps with stories even when the evidence is thin. Here's the thing. System 1 doesn't just give you impressions, it gives you certainty. It feels right. You don't say, maybe he's a businessman. You say, he is a businessman. And once that label lands, System 2 usually just nods along. Kahneman illustrates this with an idea he calls, what you see is all there is, or WISIAT. It's the tendency to build a complete picture out of the information we have, without pausing to ask what's missing. If we see part of the puzzle, our brain acts as if it's the whole thing. Think about watching a political debate. Candidate A speaks passionately and looks confident. Candidate B stumbles on a word. Instantly, System 1 decides A is smarter, stronger, the better leader. But is that really true? Or are we just judging based on surface cues, ignoring all the data we don't have, their record, their policies, their character? That's WISIAT at work. I can't help but think about times in my life when I misjudged people because of this. Meeting someone at a noisy party and assuming they were rude because they didn't talk much, only to find out later they were shy, not arrogant. Or reading one negative review of a product and deciding it was terrible, ignoring hundreds of positive ones. My brain didn't stop to say, wait, you don't have the full picture. It just stitched a story from the scraps it had. Kahneman explains that this jump-to-conclusion habit isn't a flaw. It's efficient. Our ancestors didn't have time to weigh every possibility when they saw movement in the bushes. Quick judgment meant survival. If you assume snake and jump, you live. If you wait for full evidence, you might not. System 1 evolved to give us answers fast, not necessarily right. But in the modern world, where decisions are complex, this instinct can backfire. Think about investing money. You see a stock climbing for a few weeks. System 1 whispers, it's a winner. You feel confident, maybe even excited. But you don't see the hidden risks, the broader market trends, the missing data. What you see feels like all there is, but it isn't. What fascinates me here is how confident System 1 makes us. It doesn't just guess, It insists, and the more coherent the story feels, the more certain we become, even if the story is built on thin air. This explains why people can be so sure of things that later turn out false. Rumors, stereotypes, snap judgments. The mind loves a neat story more than it loves truth. Kahneman gives examples of how quickly we leap from little evidence to sweeping conclusions. Show someone a smiling stranger, and they'll rate that person as kind, generous, trustworthy. Show them the same stranger frowning, and suddenly the ratings flip. Nothing changed except the expression, but System 1 turns that tiny cue into a full personality profile. I find this both amusing and alarming. Amusing because it's so human. We're natural storytellers, even about people we don't know. Alarming because it means our judgments are often more about us than about reality. We see what we want to see, and then we defend it as fact. The lesson here, for me, is not to demonize System 1, but to challenge it. When I catch myself making a snap judgment, I try to ask, what am I not seeing? What information is missing? It doesn't always change my first impression, but it creates space for doubt. And doubt, in this sense, is healthy. Kahneman leaves us with a sobering truth. The ease of jumping to conclusions makes us overconfident. We trust our instincts far more than we should. The mind isn't wired to naturally say, I don't know. Instead, it says, here's the answer, even when the evidence is flimsy. So Chapter 7 teaches us humility. To recognize that certainty is often an illusion, born from partial information dressed up as the whole. The next time you feel absolutely sure about a person, a decision, or a prediction, pause. Ask yourself, is this confidence built on facts, or just on the little my System 1 happened to notice? Because in the end, what you see is not all there is. And remembering that might be the first step toward seeing the world a little more clearly. Chapter 8. Imagine you're walking through a busy city street. A taxi speeds past, and for a split second, you catch only a glimpse of the driver's face. Without effort, your brain whispers, tired, maybe annoyed. You didn't stop to analyze wrinkles or measure the downturn of a mouth. The impression just appeared. This is judgment by System 1, fast, automatic, and effortless. In Chapter 8, Kahneman dives into how System 1 forms these snap judgments, and more importantly, how often we treat them as reliable truth. The human brain is wired to read the world quickly. We judge faces, voices, gestures, all in milliseconds. And remarkably, we're often right. We can tell joy from sadness, friendliness from hostility, almost instinctively. That's why we can watch a silent film and still understand the story. Our minds are constantly decoding signals without conscious effort. But here's the tricky part. While these quick judgments are efficient, they're also riddled with bias. System 1 relies on shortcuts, mental rules of thumb called heuristics. They work well in many situations, but they can also trick us. Take the halo effect. If you find someone attractive, your brain automatically assumes they're also kind, intelligent, maybe even trustworthy. You don't have evidence for any of that, but the positive glow of one trait spills into others. The opposite is true too. If someone rubs you the wrong way, you might assume they're lazy, careless, or dishonest, even without proof. I've fallen for this countless times, meeting someone charismatic and immediately giving them more credit than they deserve, or disliking someone's tone in an email and then interpreting all their future messages as rude. My brain wasn't weighing facts. It was letting one impression dominate the rest. Kahneman explains that System 1 doesn't just jump to conclusions, it also creates the illusion of validity. Once we form an impression, it feels true, even if the evidence is thin or misleading. That's why first impressions stick so powerfully. Once System 1 has spoken, System 2 rarely bothers to intervene. Here's a famous example. In studies, people are shown brief clips of teachers, just a few seconds long, without sound. Incredibly, their ratings of the teacher's warmth, competence, and likability often match the ratings given by students who spent an entire semester in those classes. Snap judgments, it turns out, can mimic long-term assessments, but that doesn't mean they're always accurate. It just means System 1 is good at creating quick, consistent stories. The danger comes when we rely on these judgments in situations that demand accuracy. Hiring someone for a job, deciding whether to trust a witness, evaluating a leader. In those cases, impressions can mislead us badly. A confident speaker might seem competent, but lack substance. A nervous applicant might seem weak, but actually be brilliant. System 1 doesn't care. It reacts to surface cues and locks in an opinion. This reminds me of a time I worked on a group project. One teammate was shy, spoke quietly, and often hesitated before offering ideas. My System 1 pegged them as unsure, maybe less capable. But as the weeks went on, they turned out to have the sharpest insights, catching mistakes the rest of us missed. I had judged wrong, simply because my brain mistook hesitance for incompetence. Kahneman points out that System 1 thrives on coherence. If the story feels consistent, it feels true. Show me a friendly face, a confident tone, and neat clothing, and my brain tells me, this person is competent. Show me a scowl, a shaky voice, and messy hair, and I might think, this person is unreliable. The judgments are instant, but they're built on flimsy cues. So what can we do about it? For me, the key lesson is to notice when an impression arrives too quickly. When I feel certain about someone after only a glance, I try to remind myself, this is System 1 talking. It might be right, but it might also be projecting a story. Kahneman doesn't suggest we can escape snap judgments altogether. They're baked into how we function. Without them, we'd be paralyzed, second-guessing every face and every tone. The challenge isn't to silence System 1, it's to train System 2 to step in when the stakes are high. One simple trick is to slow down. When hiring, for example, don't rely only on gut feel in the interview. Look at actual performance data. When evaluating someone's trustworthiness, ask yourself what evidence supports your impression and what might contradict it. It's not natural. We prefer neat stories. But it's necessary if we want to avoid being fooled by our own minds. So Chapter 8 leaves us with a reminder. Our judgments, as quick and confident as they feel, are not infallible truths. They're guesses, dressed up as certainty. System 1 hands us answers before we've asked the full questions. And if we're not careful, we'll let those answers guide our decisions without ever realizing how thin the evidence was. The next time you meet someone new, pay attention to that first spark of impression. But don't marry it immediately. Ask what's missing, what System 1 might be ignoring. Because the truth of a person, like the truth of the world, is rarely captured in a single glance. Chapter 9. Let me start with a riddle. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? If you just thought 10 cents, you're not alone. That's the answer most people blurt out. It feels right. It pops into the mind without effort. But of course it's wrong. The correct answer is 5 cents. The bat would then be wallow 5 pies, bringing the total to $1.10. It takes only a few seconds of deliberate checking to see the mistake, but most of us never pause. This is the heart of Chapter 9. The way our minds often substitute easy questions for hard ones without realizing it. Kahneman calls this the process of heuristic substitution. Here's how it works. When faced with a tough problem, instead of engaging slow, effortful reasoning, System 1 swoops in and replaces the difficult question with a simpler one. Then it answers that question instead, and we rarely notice the swap. Imagine you're asked, should I invest in this startup? That's a complex question. It requires research, statistics, weighing risks. But your brain might silently replace it with, do I like the founder? Or, does this idea excite me? And then you answer that simpler question, while believing you've answered the original. It's a brilliant shortcut. It saves time, it feels smooth, but it also leads to systematic mistakes. Think about politics. Voters are asked, which candidate will best lead the nation? That's incredibly complicated. Instead, many answer, which candidate do I like more? Which one seems relatable? In their minds, they've tackled the big question, but really, they've answered a simpler one. I've caught myself doing this countless times. Once, a friend asked me if a book was worth reading. Instead of weighing the book's actual content or reviews, my brain jumped to, did I enjoy the cover design? Did I like the first sentence? I gave my answer confidently, but really, I had substituted an easy question for a hard one. Kahneman explains that this substitution happens invisibly. System 1 doesn't announce, "Excuse me, I'll be swapping out your tough question for a simpler one." It just does it. And because the simpler question feels connected, we trust the answer. Here's another experiment he shares. People are asked, "How happy are you with your life?" That's a massive question, involving dozens of factors: relationships, work, health, meaning. But often, they unconsciously replace it with, "What's my mood right now?" If they're smiling because the sun is out, they report being happier with life overall. The entire evaluation shifts based on something trivial. This, to me, is both amusing and unsettling. It shows how fragile our sense of judgment really is. We think we're evaluating deep questions, but often we're just skimming the surface, letting System 1 hand us an easy substitute. But there's a silver lining. Once you know this trick, you can start catching it. You can ask yourself, am I answering the question I was actually asked, or just the one that feels easiest? It's not foolproof, but even asking the question gives System 2 a chance to wake up. Another important point in this chapter is how these substitutions affect probability and risk. Suppose you're asked, what's the probability this person will succeed as a CEO? That's complex. Success depends on countless factors. But your brain might swap it for, does this person look confident? Do they remind me of a successful leader? And suddenly, appearance stands in for probability. It feels logical, but it's a trick of System 1. Kahneman warns them this substitution doesn't just shape personal decisions, it shapes markets, elections, entire societies. When enough people answer easy questions instead of hard ones, whole systems can tilt based on superficial cues. For me, the lesson of Chapter 9 is a little unsettling. I need to accept that my mind is slippery. It often takes the path of least resistance, swapping hard for easy without asking permission. And yet, I find hope here too. Because once you see the trick, you can start noticing it. Next time I'm tempted to say, this product seems good, I'll ask, am I judging the product or just the packaging? Next time I feel sure a leader is competent, I'll ask, am I responding to their record or just their smile? Kahneman doesn't tell us to distrust every judgment. We'd be paralyzed if we did. But he nudges us to slow down, to recognize that sometimes the quick answer isn't the real answer. Sometimes it's just the easy one. So Chapter 9 closes Part 1 with a sobering reminder. Our minds are brilliant at giving us the feeling of certainty, of clarity, of confidence. But beneath that smooth surface, they're often answering the wrong questions. The challenge isn't to eliminate this tendency, it's to shine a light on it. To ask ourselves, gently but firmly, am I solving the real problem here or just the one that feels easiest? Because in that pause, in that awareness, lies the chance to make better choices. By the way, if you're enjoying these insights and want more powerful book breakdowns like this, don't forget to hit subscribe to MindSpark Summaries, where we turn big ideas into life lessons. Part 2. Heuristics and Biases. Chapter 10. Picture yourself in a casino. Bright lights, the sound of slot machines, people cheering at the tables. You walk up to a roulette wheel and watch as the ball lands on red, 3 times in a row. Instantly, your gut whispers, black is due next. It feels like the universe owes you balance. But of course, the wheel doesn't know or care what happened before. Each spin is independent. Still, your brain insists on spotting a pattern. This is the heart of Chapter 10, the law of small numbers. Kahneman tells us that humans are terrible at grasping statistics. We act as though small samples should represent the whole truth. If something happens a few times, we assume it reveals the larger pattern. But small numbers are noisy, and randomness doesn't always look random. Yet our brains can't stand the idea of pure chance, so we impose stories on it. Think about coin flips. If you flip a coin 6 times, and it lands on heads 5 of them, most people feel uneasy. They think the coin is biased, or that tails is due. But in reality, such streaks are perfectly normal in small samples. Randomness has clumps, just like stars in the night sky. Still, System 1 doesn't like randomness. It prefers neat, balanced stories. Here's a personal confession. Years ago, I watched my favorite basketball team lose 3 games in a row. I told myself, they're just not in championship form this season. But that streak turned out meaningless. They later won the title. I was guilty of what Kahneman describes, mistaking small samples for the big picture. This bias shows up everywhere. In business, managers might see one employee succeed spectacularly and assume they've cracked the formula for success, ignoring that luck often plays a role. In education, a teacher might judge a student's entire potential from just a few test scores. In medicine, a doctor might trust results from a tiny clinical trial, forgetting that small samples are unreliable. Kahneman shares a striking example from education research. Administrators once believed that small schools produced better students because they often showed higher average test scores. But the truth was statistical. Small schools also produce the lowest scores. Why? Because small samples swing more wildly. Randomness hits harder when the group is tiny. What looked like evidence of quality was really just noise. This, to me, is eye-opening. It means we live surrounded by illusions of meaning. Headlines shout about trends from small surveys. Businesses celebrate success stories built on a handful of cases. Politicians argue from isolated anecdotes. And we, eager for patterns, swallow these stories whole. System 1 thrives on coherence. If it sees a streak, it invents a reason. This stock is hot. This player is on fire. This town breeds geniuses. It doesn't pause to ask whether the sample is too small to matter. That's the job of System 2, and too often, System 2 is asleep. What fascinates me is how uncomfortable true randomness feels. If you generate a random sequence of coin flips, most people think it looks too streaky. If you ask people to invent a random sequence themselves, they avoid streaks, sprinkling heads and tails evenly. Our brains equate random with balanced, but that's not reality. Reality has streaks. True randomness looks suspicious to us. I've noticed this in my own life with music playlists. When I shuffle songs and the same artist pops up twice in a row, I think, that can't be random. But of course it can. That's exactly what randomness looks like. It clusters. My frustration isn't with the algorithm. It's with my brain's flawed sense of probability. The lesson of Chapter 10 is humbling. Don't trust small samples. When you see a streak, when you notice a pattern in a handful of cases, remind yourself, it might mean nothing. The mind craves order, but the world is noisy. Kahneman's advice echoes loudly in today's world of data. With endless statistics flying at us, it's easy to seize on small numbers as proof of something grand. But unless the sample is large, what you're seeing might be more illusion than truth. For me, the takeaway is simple but powerful. Pause before drawing conclusions. When I hear that 3 out of 5 people loved this product, I remind myself, that's too few to trust. When I hear about a town with an unusually high number of cancer cases, I remember that clusters happen in randomness too. System 1 hates uncertainty, so it invents patterns in noise. But if we want to think clearly, we need to resist that urge. The world is not always as orderly as our brains want it to be. So the next time you catch yourself saying, this streak means something, take a breath. Maybe it does. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the law of small numbers fooling you. Chapter 11. Imagine you're at a charity auction. The host kicks things off by saying, let's start the bidding at $500. Suddenly, that number, $500, lodges itself in your mind. Even if you were only planning to spend $100, your sense of what's reasonable has shifted. Maybe you stretch to $300. Maybe you even go higher. That first number, dropped casually, has anchored you. This is the power of anchoring, the bias explored in Chapter 11. Anchoring happens when our minds latch onto an initial number, word, or idea, and then adjust only slightly from it. The first figure acts like a mental magnet, pulling all later judgments closer than they should be. And here's the kicker. Even when we know the anchor is random or irrelevant, it still shapes us. Kahneman describes a classic experiment. People spun a wheel of fortune rigged to stop on either 10 or 65. Then they were asked, what percentage of African countries are in the United Nations? Those who saw 10 gave much lower estimates than those who saw 65. The wheel number had nothing to do with Africa, but it became the anchor anyway. I find this almost unsettling. It means our judgments aren't as independent as we think. Random numbers, background noise, even arbitrary suggestions can nudge us, and we rarely notice. Think about buying a car. The dealer starts at $30,000. Even if you negotiate down to $27,000, you feel like you've won. But maybe the fair price was $24,000 all along. You anchored on their number, and everything else revolved around it. Or think about a courtroom. Studies show that judges, experienced professionals, can be swayed by anchors too. When prosecutors suggest a sentence, even when it's extreme, judges' decisions shift toward that number. One study even found that when judges rolled dice loaded to land on high numbers before sentencing, their punishments came out harsher. Dice. That's how deep anchoring runs. Personally, I've seen this bias in my own life with shopping. When I see a shirt priced at $80, then marked down to $40, it feels like a bargain. But if I'd just seen it at $40, with no original price, I might think it's overpriced. The anchor shapes the entire perception of value. What fascinates me is that anchoring works in two ways. Sometimes it's deliberate, what Kahneman calls anchoring as a strategy. Salespeople, negotiators, advertisers, they all know the trick. Throw out a high number, and the rest will orbit around it. But sometimes it's unconscious. Our own minds generate anchors without us realizing it. For example, if I ask you, was Gandhi older or younger than 144 when he died? You'd laugh, of course younger. But then, if I immediately ask, how old was he when he died? Your answer will likely be higher than if I'd asked whether he was older or younger than 35. Even absurd anchors influence us. This tells me something sobering. We're more suggestible than we'd like to believe. Even random nonsense can bend our judgments. Kahneman also points out that anchoring is strongest when we're uncertain. If you know little about African nations or car prices, you lean heavily on the first number you hear. But even experts aren't immune. Knowledge softens the effect, but it doesn't erase it. So what can we do? For me, the key is awareness. When I walk into a negotiation, I remind myself, the first number is not sacred. It's just a move, not the truth. When I see a discount, I ask, do I want this at today's price, not yesterday's? And when I feel unusually certain about a guess, I pause to ask, did I just get anchored without realizing it? Anchoring teaches us a humbling lesson about human nature. We like to imagine we're rational calculators, weighing evidence cleanly. In reality, we're storytellers, tugged by the first number that enters the room. That number sticks, echoing in the background, shaping every judgment that follows. So, Chapter 11 leaves us with a simple but powerful caution. Don't take the first number too seriously. Whether it comes from a salesperson, a headline, or even a spin of a wheel, it may have less to do with reality than you think. And maybe, just maybe, when you catch yourself anchored, you can loosen the chain, if only a little. Chapter 12. Picture this. A plane crashes, and the story dominates the news cycle for weeks. The images replay on television, survivors share harrowing tales, and experts speculate endlessly about what went wrong. A month later, you're booking a flight, and suddenly your palms sweat. You hesitate. Flying feels dangerous. But statistically, it's still far safer than driving a car. This is the availability heuristic, the focus of Chapter 12. Kahneman explains that our minds judge the likelihood of events not by cold statistics, but by how easily examples come to mind. If something is vivid, recent, or emotionally charged, it feels more common, even if it's rare. Take shark attacks. They're vanishingly rare, but after seeing one dramatic news story, people cancel beach trips. Meanwhile, car accidents, thousands of times more deadly, barely register in our daily fears. The difference isn't risk, it's availability. The easier an example is to recall, the more probable it feels. I remember vividly after the 2004 tsunami, people were terrified of the ocean. For months, every ripple of news about earthquakes fueled panic. Yet earthquakes didn't suddenly become more frequent. They became more available to memory. That's the trick of System 1. It equates ease of recall with probability. Kahneman shows how this bias shapes public opinion. Ask people if tornadoes kill more Americans each year than asthma. Most say tornadoes. Why? Tornadoes make the news. Asthma deaths don't. In reality, asthma kills far more people. But tornadoes are dramatic, visual, unforgettable. Availability distorts the truth. This explains why fears often don't match reality. People worry about terrorism far more than about slipping in the shower. Parents obsess over child abductions by strangers, even though statistically children are more at risk from car accidents or household hazards. The emotional power of a story outweighs the silent weight of numbers. I've seen this in my own life. When a friend once had their house broken into, I suddenly felt unsafe in my own neighborhood. I bought locks, cameras, even a security system. A year later, when nothing else happened, my fear faded. My risk hadn't changed. The availability of the example had. What fascinates me is how availability isn't just about fear, it also shapes optimism. If I can easily recall successful entrepreneurs, I might overestimate my own chances of launching a successful startup. If all I hear are stories of lottery winners, buying a ticket feels like a real opportunity. System 1 says, if it comes to mind easily, it must happen often. Kahneman emphasizes that this isn't stupidity, it's efficiency. Our brains evolved to use memory as a shortcut. If danger is vivid and nearby, it makes sense to pay attention. But in the modern world, where media amplifies the rare and ignores the mundane, availability often misguides us. Here's another wrinkle: emotional impact. The more emotional the memory, the more available it becomes. That's why a single tragic story can outweigh dry statistics. Tell someone that thousands die from malaria each year, and they nod. Tell them one child's story, show a photo, share her name, and donations pour in. Emotion makes the example stick, and stickiness drives judgment. Personally, this makes me rethink how I consume news. If all I see are disasters, my worldview tilts toward fear and chaos. If all I see are success stories, I become unrealistically optimistic. Availability isn't just about memory. It's about what the world feeds into memory. So what's the lesson here? For me, it's to pause before equating vividness with truth. If something feels common, I ask, is it truly frequent or just memorable? If I'm afraid of an event, I ask, am I reacting to risk or just to how easy it is to imagine? Kahneman doesn't suggest we can turn off this bias. It's too deeply wired. But awareness gives us a chance to counter it. Statistics may never feel as powerful as stories, but they can anchor us when our emotions try to take the wheel. Chapter 12 leaves us with a sobering insight. Our picture of the world is shaped less by reality than by availability. We fear what's vivid, not what's likely. We hope for what's memorable, not what's probable. And until we learn to question that, our judgments will continue to bend toward the dramatic, not the true. Chapter 13. Imagine two headlines appear back-to-back on your news feed. The first, a plane crash in Europe kills 120 passengers. The second, local hospital reports rise in deaths from heart disease. Which one grabs your attention? Which one feels scarier? For most of us, the plane crash dominates, even though heart disease claims far more lives every single day. Why? Because the crash is sudden, dramatic, and emotionally charged. Heart disease feels distant, statistical, even dull. This is where Kahneman takes us in Chapter 13, how availability, emotion, and risk dance together to shape our perceptions. He explains that the availability heuristic isn't just about what we can recall easily. It's also about how we feel about those memories. Emotion amplifies availability. The more vivid, shocking, or emotionally loaded an event, the more it sticks in our mind, and the more likely we are to overestimate its frequency. Think of shark attacks. If you've ever watched Jaws or seen a sensational headline, you can almost feel the terror of dark water and sudden teeth. That fear sticks, making shark attacks feel common. Meanwhile, drowning, statistically far more likely, barely stirs the imagination. The difference isn't risk, it's emotional weight. I've noticed this in my own life. After seeing a documentary about rare plane crashes, I caught myself gripping the armrest during turbulence, even though I knew the odds were tiny. The emotion overpowered the numbers. Kahneman would say my System 1 had been primed by vivid stories, dragging my perception of risk far from reality. Here's the twist. This isn't just about fear. Positive emotions distort probability too. If I hear about someone striking it rich in crypto, that story becomes sticky, available, exciting. My brain whispers, maybe I could too. It doesn't matter that the odds are slim. The glow of one dramatic success overshadows countless failures. Kahneman introduces an important distinction here between experiential probability and statistical probability. Experiential probability is how likely something feels, shaped by vividness and emotion. Statistical probability is the cold math. And the gap between the two is where biases thrive. Consider how people buy insurance. After a big flood, sales of flood insurance skyrocket, only to plummet again within a few years. The actual risk doesn't change much, but the emotional availability of the flood fades, and so does the willingness to pay. Insurance markets don't run on statistics. They run on stories. This makes me think about how policymakers struggle with public opinion. People might clamor for protection against rare but terrifying risks, like terrorism, while ignoring mundane killers like high blood pressure. Emotion drives priorities, not numbers. And when governments respond, resources can end up misallocated. Kahneman also points out that our emotions don't scale very well. One tragic death can move us deeply, while thousands of deaths in a distant country barely stir us. Psychologists call this the identifiable victim effect. We care more about one named, pictured individual than about faceless statistics. Our compassion, like our fear, is ruled by vividness, not magnitude. Personally, I find this both deeply human and deeply troubling. It shows the warmth of our empathy. We care about stories, but it also shows the limits of our rationality. We can weep for one child and ignore millions. Our feelings don't match reality's scale. So what can we do with this knowledge? For me, it's a reminder to pause when risk feels overwhelming or underwhelming. If a danger seems terrifying, I ask, is it truly frequent or just emotionally vivid? If something feels safe, I ask, am I ignoring it because it's boring, not because it's rare? Kahneman doesn't say we can erase these biases, but he suggests that being aware of the tug-of-war between emotion and probability gives us a chance to balance them. It's about letting System 2 step in, not to silence emotion, but to temper it with perspective. Chapter 13 leaves us with a powerful insight. Our perception of risk is less about numbers than about narratives. The dramatic dominates the mundane, the vivid outshouts the silent. And until we learn to see through that, we'll keep fearing the wrong things and neglecting the real ones. So next time you find yourself clutching the armrest on a flight, remember, your fear is real, but the risk is not. And the next time a quiet headline about heart disease scrolls by, maybe give it more weight. Because sometimes the scariest dangers are the ones that don't make good stories. Chapter 14. Imagine this. You're given a short description of a man named Tom W. Tom is shy and withdrawn, with little interest in people or in the world of reality. He is tidy and organized, with a need for order and clarity. He enjoys science fiction and spends much of his time writing computer programs or playing video games. Now, if I ask you, what is Tom's likely field of study? What comes to mind first? Most people instantly say, computer science. It feels obvious, doesn't it? Tom's description fits the stereotype. But here's the twist. This is exactly the trap Kahneman explores in Chapter 14, the representativeness heuristic. Representativeness is our tendency to judge something by how much it resembles our mental prototype, while ignoring the actual statistics. In other words, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, we assume it's a duck, even if the odds suggest otherwise. Take Tom W. again. In the 1970s, when this study was first conducted, computer science was a relatively small field. Far more people studied humanities, social sciences, or business. Statistically, Tom was much more likely to be in one of those majors. But because his description matched the nerdy programmer stereotype, people ignored the base rates and went straight with the representative story. This is the power of System 1. It loves coherence, so when it sees a match between a description and a category, it jumps to conclusions. System 2 could step in and say, wait, how many people are actually in that field? But most of the time, it doesn't bother. The stereotype feels stronger than the math. I've caught myself doing this all the time. Meeting someone wearing glasses and speaking formally, I assume they're an academic. Seeing someone athletic in gym clothes, I assume they're a trainer. Never mind that statistically, most people in glasses aren't professors, and most people in gym clothes aren't personal trainers. My brain prefers the neat story. Kahneman points out that representativeness can blind us to reality in big ways. Consider hiring. An interviewer hears that a candidate is outgoing and charming and instantly imagines them excelling in sales. But maybe the candidate struggles with persistence or numbers, qualities more important than charm. The fit with the stereotype overwhelms the facts. Or think about investing. A company releases an innovative new gadget. It fits our mental image of a disruptive startup. We project success, ignoring that most startups, no matter how cool, fail. We see the representative story, not the statistical truth. This bias also fuels stereotypes in social life. We meet someone who matches our image of a certain group, and we leap to conclusions about their behavior, values, or competence. We judge by resemblance, not by probability. It's quick, it feels right, but it often leads us astray. One of Kahneman's most important lessons here is about base rates. Base rates are the actual frequencies in the real world, the ground truth numbers. If 90% of students study humanities and 10% study computer science, the base rate says any random student is far more likely to be in humanities. But when we hear Tom's description, the base rates vanish. We lock onto resemblance instead. This isn't just a quirk, it's a systematic error. We consistently undervalue base rates and overvalue stories. That's why people fear dying in a terrorist attack more than in a car accident, even though the base rates scream the opposite. Representativeness makes the rare story loom larger than the everyday risk. What fascinates me is how confident we feel in these judgments. When I think Tom is a computer science student, it doesn't feel like a guess. It feels like knowledge. That's the illusion of representativeness. The match between stereotype and description feels so compelling that System 2 doesn't even get invited to the conversation. For me, the takeaway is simple, but challenging. Whenever I find myself judging based on resemblance, I try to pause and ask, what are the base rates? If I'm evaluating a business idea, I remind myself, most startups fail. If I'm guessing a stranger's profession, I remind myself, most people don't match the stereotype I have in my head. It's not about rejecting intuition, but about tempering it with reality. Kahneman's Chapter 14 is a reminder that resemblance is seductive, but statistics are stubborn. The world doesn't bend to stereotypes, no matter how neatly they fit. So next time you meet your own Tom W., remember, just because the story feels right doesn't mean it's true. The odds are often hiding in plain sight, if only we're willing to look at them. Chapter 15. Let me tell you a story. Back in the 1980s, two psychologists, Kahneman himself and his colleague Amos Tversky, introduced a woman named Linda to groups of students. They gave this description. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Then they asked a simple question: which is more probable? Linda is a bank teller. Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. Almost everyone chose option 2. It feels right. Linda sounds like a feminist. So naturally, the story bank teller plus feminist feels more representative. But here's the trap. Mathematically, the probability of two things being true together can never be higher than the probability of one thing alone. Linda can't be more likely to be a feminist bank teller than just a bank teller. And yet, that's what most people believed. This error is so common it's famous now, the conjunction fallacy. Why do we fall for it? Because System 1 loves coherent stories more than cold logic. Bank teller feels bland. even mismatched with Linda's description. Bank teller and feminist feels like a complete narrative. So we pick the story, not the math. I remember the first time I heard the Linda problem. I caught myself thinking, well, obviously she's a feminist. It felt so natural. But then the logic hit me. Every feminist bank teller is still a bank teller. The broader category always contains the narrower one. My gut was wrong even though it felt so convincing. This is the deeper lesson of Chapter 15. Our minds confuse plausibility with probability. A vivid, coherent story feels more likely than a dull, general one, even when the math says otherwise. Think about crime dramas. A detective presents a neat narrative, the jealous ex, the motive, the weapon. It all clicks. We find it compelling. Meanwhile, the messy reality of crime, often random, chaotic, feels less believable, even if it's more probable. Coherence seduces us. Kahneman shows how this bias leaks into everyday life. Investors believe a detailed, story-rich prediction about the economy more than a vague one, even though every added detail lowers probability. Doctors sometimes prefer a diagnosis that fits a patient's story neatly, ignoring the statistical likelihood of simpler explanations. We reward coherence, even at the expense of truth. For me, this hit close to home. I once heard two predictions about a company I was following. The first, its stock will fall. The second, its stock will fall because its CEO is young, inexperienced, and the market is skeptical. The second felt more persuasive, but logically, it was less probable, because for it to be true, all those extra details had to line up. I wasn't judging probability. I was judging storytelling. Kahneman and Tversky's Linda experiment revealed something profound about human thinking. We don't naturally think in terms of statistics. We think in terms of stories, and when a story feels right, it can overpower even the simplest logic. This makes me wonder, how often in life do I choose Linda the feminist bank teller over Linda the bank teller? How often do I trust a detailed explanation over a simple truth just because it feels better? The conjunction fallacy also reveals why conspiracy theories can be so seductive. A vague idea, something went wrong, feels unsatisfying. A detailed story, a secret group manipulated events behind the scenes for a hidden agenda, feels richer, more coherent. And so, people find it more believable, even though every added detail makes it statistically less likely. What I take from Chapter 15 is a challenge. When a story feels perfect, pause. Ask yourself if you're confusing plausibility with probability. Is this explanation really more likely, or just more appealing? Sometimes the simplest, most boring answer is the truest one. In the end, Linda isn't just a character in a psychology experiment. She's a mirror. She shows us how our minds prefer neat, detailed stories to plain, statistical reality. And unless we learn to question that instinct, we'll keep falling for the conjunction fallacy, over and over again. So the next time someone offers you a story that feels just too perfect, remember Linda. She's probably still a bank teller, and that's more likely than anything else. Chapter 16. Imagine you're watching the evening news. The anchor says, in a recent study, children who eat lots of ice cream score higher on math tests. Instantly, your mind starts building a story. Maybe sugar sharpens the brain. Maybe smart kids crave ice cream. Whatever the theory, you start searching for a cause. But hold on. What if the link is explained by something else entirely? Perhaps it's summer. Kids eat more ice cream in summer, and they also happen to have more free time for tutoring or enrichment programs. The ice cream doesn't cause better math scores. It's just along for the ride. This is the trap Kahneman highlights in Chapter 16. When faced with statistics, our minds instinctively reach for causes, often ignoring the possibility of randomness or hidden variables. System 1 is a storyteller. It craves coherence. When it sees numbers or correlations, it doesn't think, this might just be chance. It thinks, why? What's the explanation? And once it finds a cause, even a flimsy one, it clings to it. I've caught myself doing this all the time. If I meet 3 people from the same company and they're all enthusiastic, I think, that company must have an amazing culture. Maybe true. Or maybe I just happened to meet the 3 most enthusiastic employees. Statistically, small samples can swing wildly, but my brain prefers a neat causal story. Kahneman points out that this is why people distrust statistics, especially when they clash with personal experience. If a study shows that a certain medicine works on average, but your neighbor took it and didn't improve, you might dismiss the statistics. Your brain gives more weight to a vivid causal story, it didn't work for him, than to abstract probabilities. This bias shows up in how we explain human behavior. If a child struggles in school, we might blame bad teachers, poor parenting, or laziness. Rarely do we stop to think about random variance, measurement error, or pure chance. System 1 isn't built to think statistically. It's built to assign causes. Think about sports commentary. When a basketball player has a hot hand, commentators invent stories about confidence, rhythm, or mindset. In reality, much of it may just be random streaks. But randomness feels unsatisfying. Causes feel compelling. I remember once playing poker with friends. One of them kept winning hand after hand. Instantly, we started speculating. Maybe he's bluffing better. Maybe he's reading us. Only later did we realize it was mostly luck. But our minds resisted that explanation. We wanted skill, story, cause. This chapter also touches on why conspiracy theories spread so easily. When random events line up in strange ways, we refuse to believe it's coincidence. We invent hidden hands, secret plots, elaborate causes. Pure chance feels too thin. We need meaning. What fascinates me is how universal this is. From ancient myths explaining eclipses as angry gods, to modern people linking vaccines to unrelated illnesses, our species prefers causal stories over statistical ones. It's how our minds are wired. But here's the danger. This tendency blinds us to the truth. When we ignore base rates and randomness, we misjudge risk, reward, and responsibility. We see patterns in noise, causes where there are none, and we act on them. Sometimes harmlessly, sometimes with serious consequences. So what's the lesson of Chapter 16? For me, it's to develop a habit of asking, could this be chance? Could randomness explain what I'm seeing? It's not natural. System 1 hates randomness, but it's necessary if I want to think clearly. Kahneman isn't saying we should reject causes altogether. Of course, causes exist, but he warns us not to jump to them too quickly. If the sample is small, if the data is noisy, if the pattern is thin, we should pause before building a grand narrative. Personally, I try to remind myself of this whenever I see headlines like, "People who eat chocolate live longer." Maybe true, maybe not. But before I stock up on chocolate bars, I ask, what else could explain this? How big was the study? Could it be coincidence? Chapter 16 leaves us with a humbling truth. Our minds are wired to chase causes, even when the world is messier, noisier, and more random than we'd like to admit. So the next time you see a surprising statistic, resist the urge to explain it right away. Sit with the possibility that there may not be a neat story. Because sometimes, the hardest truth to accept is the simplest one. Things happen. By chance. Chapter 17. Picture a high school athlete who just had the best game of his life. He scored more points than ever, the crowd went wild, and the coach couldn't stop praising him. Now imagine what happens in the very next game. Does he soar even higher? Or does he return to something closer to his usual performance? Most likely, he regresses. Not because he got worse, but because his spectacular performance was partly skill, partly luck. And luck, by definition, doesn't last. This is the heart of Chapter 17, Regression to the Mean. Kahneman explains it simply. Extreme outcomes are usually followed by more moderate ones. Tall parents tend to have tall kids, but not quite as tall as themselves. Students who ace one exam often do a little worse on the next. Businesses that dominate one year often slide back toward average the next. It's not magic. It's statistics. Yet our minds resist this truth. Instead of seeing regression, we invent causes. If an athlete plays worse after a great game, we say he got overconfident. If a student scores lower, we say she slacked off. If a company's stock falls after soaring, we say management made mistakes. We prefer stories to statistics. I remember once giving a presentation that went unusually well. The next one felt flat by comparison. I tortured myself with explanations. Maybe I hadn't prepared enough. Maybe the audience was tougher. But looking back, Kahneman's lesson is clear. The first talk was boosted by luck. Perfect timing, a receptive audience, just the right jokes landing. It wasn't sustainable. And the second talk was just me sliding back toward my average. This is why regression to the mean fools us into seeing patterns where none exist. Kahneman tells a story from his days in the Israeli Air Force. Flight instructors insisted that harsh criticism worked better than praise. When they praised a student for an excellent landing, the next attempt was usually worse. When they criticized a poor landing, the next one was usually better. To the instructors, this proved criticism was effective and praise was harmful. But in reality, both were just regression to the mean. Exceptional highs are usually followed by lower results. Exceptional lows by higher ones. It's sobering, isn't it? How often do we mistake natural statistical swings for evidence of cause and effect? A student improves after tutoring. Was it the tutoring, or just regression from an unusually bad score? A new CEO takes over and the company rebounds. Was it leadership, or just a return to normal after a slump? Our minds prefer the neat story of cause, but the numbers often tell a quieter truth. What fascinates me here is how this bias shapes public life. Think of Sports Illustrated curses. Athletes featured on the cover often see their performance dip soon after. Fans whisper about jinxes, but the real culprit is regression. The magazine picks players after extraordinary performances that, statistically, are unlikely to repeat. The same goes for schools labeled the best in rankings. They often tumble in the next year's list, not because they suddenly worsened, but because rankings exaggerate extremes. A streak of good luck, exceptional teachers, motivated students, strong funding can elevate results temporarily. Over time, the luck fades, and performance returns to the average. I find this lesson oddly comforting. It means I don't have to overanalyze every rise and fall in my own life. If I have an unusually good day, I shouldn't expect every day to match it. If I stumble badly, I shouldn't assume I'm doomed. Chances are, I'll drift back toward my personal mean. But it also teaches humility. When judging others, students, employees, leaders, I need to remember regression. Improvement after failure doesn't always mean the remedy worked. Decline after success doesn't always mean someone got lazy. Sometimes it's just the mathematics of chance smoothing the edges. Kahneman's warning is clear. Regression to the mean is invisible to System 1. Our intuition hates it. We crave explanations, not randomness. But if we want to see reality, we must resist the urge to invent causes for every swing. For me, the practice is this. When I notice a big change, I pause and ask, could this just be regression? Could luck be unwinding? It doesn't make stories less tempting, but it gives System 2 a chance to step in. Chapter 17 reminds us that life is noisy. Extremes happen, but they rarely last. Success is never as permanent as it feels, and failure is rarely as final. Most of the time, we are drifting, gently but firmly, back toward the mean. Chapter 18. Picture two admissions officers reviewing college applications. One skims through essays, glances at photos, and makes snap judgments. This kid has leadership written all over him. The other quietly fills in a checklist, grades, test scores, extracurriculars, references, and tallies the results into a formula. Who do you think makes better decisions? Most people would bet on the first officer. Intuition feels richer, more human. But Kahneman shows us in Chapter 18 that, over and over, simple formulas often beat expert judgment. This might feel counterintuitive. We're raised to trust the wisdom of experts, the seasoned doctor, the experienced manager, the veteran teacher. Surely their intuition, honed over years, must outperform cold rules. But study after study says otherwise. Take hiring. Companies that rely on structured checklists, objective scores for education, experience, skills, tend to select better employees than companies that rely on gut feeling from interviews. Or take medical diagnoses. In many cases, straightforward statistical models predict outcomes more accurately than even skilled doctors. The pattern is consistent. Formulas reduce error. Intuition introduces noise. Why? Because intuition is vulnerable to bias. It's swayed by mood, by stereotypes, by irrelevant cues. If an applicant reminds the interviewer of themselves, they get an unconscious boost. If a patient looks anxious, a doctor may overestimate the seriousness of their illness. Formulas don't get distracted. They treat every case with the same yardstick. I've seen this in my own work. When I relied on gut instinct to judge projects, I often favored the flashy ones, the ones with charismatic pitches. But later, I realized the quieter, less dramatic proposals often produced better results. When I forced myself to score them systematically, using criteria like feasibility, resources, potential impact, I made fewer mistakes. My ego resisted, but the evidence was undeniable. The formula was more reliable than my gut. Kahneman doesn't deny that intuition has a place. In fact, he acknowledges that some experts do develop genuine skill. Firefighters sensing danger, chess masters spotting patterns. But that expertise requires two conditions: an environment with regular patterns and rapid feedback. Firefighting and chess provide both. College admissions, business forecasts, or stock picking do not. In messy, unpredictable fields, intuition often masquerades as wisdom, but is really just guesswork. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because most of us want to believe in our own instincts. We like to think, I can spot talent. I can tell a winner from a loser. I know it when I see it. To admit that a crude formula might outperform us feels insulting, almost dehumanizing. Kahneman recalls a project where he helped the Israeli military design selection tests for officers. At first, assessors relied on detailed observations, confident in their ability to judge leadership potential. But when simple scoring rules were introduced, measuring traits like persistence, discipline, intelligence, they consistently predicted performance better than the assessors' gut impressions. The assessors hated it. They resisted. But the numbers told the truth. This chapter made me pause and reflect. How many times have I trusted my feel for something when I could have done better with a checklist? When buying a car, hiring someone, choosing a partner for a project, how often was my intuition just noise in disguise? Of course, formulas aren't perfect. They can only measure what you decide to include. If your checklist is flawed, your results will be too. But the key insight here is humility. Our intuitions are not as magical as we think. And in uncertain environments, simple rules often protect us from our own biases. Kahneman leaves us with a practical takeaway. If you must rely on judgment, at least discipline it with structure. Break big decisions into smaller, measurable traits. Score each trait independently. Resist being swayed by overall impressions until the end. It won't feel as satisfying as a sweeping intuition, but it will usually lead you closer to the truth. For me, Chapter 18 lands with both discomfort and relief. Discomfort, because it reminds me how fallible my gut really is. Relief, because it gives me a tool to counter that fallibility. I don't have to abandon intuition entirely, but I can anchor it with structure, with rules, with a formula. So the next time I'm tempted to trust my first impression, I'll remember, intuition makes great stories, but formulas make better predictions. Quick pause here. If books like this spark your curiosity, you'll love what we do at MindSpark Summaries. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next journey. Part 3. Overconfidence. Chapter 19. Imagine standing on a cliffside, staring out at the horizon. The view is breathtaking, endless, and you feel like you can see everything clearly. But in truth, you're only seeing a slice of the world. Beyond the curve of the earth, whole landscapes remain invisible. That illusion, that sense of clarity while ignoring the unseen, is at the core of Chapter 19. Kahneman calls it the illusion of understanding. We love stories. We take the chaos of events and stitch them into neat narratives. This happened because of that. She succeeded because of talent. He failed because of arrogance. The world feels coherent, obvious, explainable. But much of that coherence is invented after the fact. We're not as good at understanding the past or predicting the future as we think. Take the 2008 financial crisis. After it happened, commentators explained it as if it had been inevitable. They pointed to reckless bankers, greedy investors, blind regulators. The story felt neat, logical, obvious. But before the crash, very few people saw it coming. The signs were visible only in hindsight. What felt inevitable afterward was invisible beforehand. This is the illusion of hindsight. We trick ourselves into believing we knew it all along. When an election result, a business collapse, or a personal betrayal happens, we weave it into a coherent story, forgetting how uncertain it once felt. Kahneman reminds us, hindsight doesn't make the past clearer, it makes it distorted. I remember once investing in a project that failed spectacularly. Looking back, I told myself, I should have known. The signs were obvious, but at the time, those signs were just one set of possibilities among many. The clarity I felt in hindsight was an illusion. I wasn't seeing the past, I was rewriting it. System 1 drives this rewriting. It craves coherence. When events line up, it tells a smooth story, editing out randomness and noise. System 2 rarely protests. The result? We feel we understand more than we do. We underestimate uncertainty, overestimate predictability, and exaggerate how much sense the world makes. Think about biographies of successful entrepreneurs. They're often framed as inevitable arcs, humble beginnings, visionary risk-taking, relentless persistence, eventual triumph. The story feels tight, logical. But for every Steve Jobs, there are countless equally persistent, equally visionary founders who failed. We don't hear their stories, so we forget how much chance and luck shape success. This illusion of understanding doesn't just distort history, it shapes our present decisions. If we think the past was predictable, we assume the future will be too. We trust our ability to forecast markets, politics, relationships. But in reality, the world is far messier than our stories allow. Kahneman uses the phrase the narrative fallacy, our tendency to create simple stories out of complex, unpredictable events. We link causes, assign motives, and smooth rough edges. It feels satisfying, but it's deceptive. The more coherent the story, the less likely it reflects the messy truth. Personally, this makes me rethink how I tell stories about my own life. When I describe how I ended up where I am, I frame it as a sequence of choices and outcomes that make sense. But really, chance encounters, lucky breaks, and random setbacks played huge roles. My story feels clear only because I've edited out the chaos. So what do we do with this insight? Kahneman doesn't suggest abandoning storytelling. Humans can't function without it. But he urges humility. When we say, I understand why that happened, we should add, or at least, I've built a story that makes sense to me. And when we say, this is what will happen next, we should admit, I could be wrong. There's more uncertainty than I feel. For me, the takeaway is simple, but powerful. The world makes less sense than I want to believe. My brain craves clarity, but reality is noisy, complex, and unpredictable. By remembering that, I can temper my overconfidence, ask better questions, and make decisions with more caution. Chapter 19 reminds us that understanding is often an illusion, hindsight is often a trick, and stories are often smoother than the truth. The next time you hear yourself say, I knew it all along, pause. Did you really? Or are you just stitching together a story to make the chaos feel neat? Because in the end, clarity is comforting, but humility is wiser. Chapter 20. Picture a horse race gambler. He studies the horses, the jockeys, the weather, the track conditions. He knows the statistics, follows the patterns, trusts his gut. When the bets are placed, he feels certain. Win or lose, that confidence feels unshakable. This is what Kahneman explores in Chapter 20, the illusion of validity. It's the deep, almost irresistible belief that our judgments are accurate, even when the evidence is thin and the outcomes are uncertain. He tells the story of his own experience in the Israeli army. Kahneman and his colleagues were tasked with assessing officer candidates. They observed exercises, watched how soldiers cooperated, and gave ratings. They felt completely confident in their evaluations. This one will make a great leader, that one won't. Their judgments felt sharp and obvious. But when they compared their predictions to actual performance in the field, the correlation was shockingly low. The candidates they were sure about often failed. The ones they dismissed sometimes thrived. Their confidence had been real, but their accuracy had been an illusion. This resonates with me. I've sat in interviews where, after 5 minutes, I felt sure about a candidate. Yes, they're perfect for the role. Or, no, they'll never fit. Later, my certainty often turned out wrong. But at the time, it didn't feel like guessing. It felt like knowing. Kahneman explains that this illusion arises because System 1 loves coherence. When we see a person behaving a certain way, we instantly spin a story about their traits. A candidate speaks confidently in one exercise, and we project confidence into every future situation. The story feels so consistent that we believe it must be true. But here's the rub. Consistent stories don't guarantee predictive power. Just because someone looks like a leader in a staged scenario doesn't mean they'll lead well in real life. Just because a stock analyst has a neat narrative about why the market will rise doesn't mean it will. Our brains mistake internal consistency for external validity. This is why experts, ironically, are often the most overconfident. The more knowledge they have, the richer their stories, and the stronger their conviction. But studies of financial analysts, political forecasters, and even seasoned psychologists reveal the same pattern. Their predictions are often no better than chance, yet their confidence remains sky high. I find this both amusing and unsettling. Amusing because I've seen friends make bold predictions about sports games, elections, tech trends, only to be wildly wrong. Unsettling because I know I've done the same. Confidence feels so good, so natural, that it blinds us to our own fallibility. Kahneman points out that confidence is not a reliable indicator of accuracy. People can feel utterly certain and still be completely wrong. In fact, the situations where we feel most confident, where the story is neat and coherent, are often the very ones where uncertainty is highest. Think about stock picking. An investor might say, "This company will succeed because it has a visionary CEO, strong branding, and loyal customers." The narrative clicks, confidence soars, but the market is chaotic, shaped by countless unpredictable forces. The neat story hides the noise. The illusion of validity makes us blind to just how fragile our predictions are. For me, the key lesson here is humility. When I feel supremely confident about a judgment, that's precisely when I should pause. Is my certainty coming from solid evidence, or from the seductive coherence of a story? Am I truly seeing reality, or just a convincing illusion? Kahneman suggests that to combat this bias, we need to separate confidence from accuracy. Ask not just how sure do I feel, but what's the actual track record of predictions like this? If past performance shows low accuracy, then high confidence should be treated with suspicion. I think back to Kahneman's army story. Even after seeing their poor track record, the evaluators still felt confident during exercises. They couldn't shake the illusion. That's the sobering truth. Knowing about the bias doesn't erase it, but it can remind us to question it. So Chapter 20 leaves us with a challenge. The next time we feel the rush of certainty, we should treat it as a warning signal, not as proof of truth. Confidence is seductive, but it's not the same as accuracy. In the end, the illusion of validity is one of the most dangerous biases, not because it makes us wrong, but because it makes us sure we're right. And that certainty, unearned and unchecked, can lead us into costly mistakes. Chapter 21. Imagine a firefighter entering a burning building. The heat is intense, smoke swirls, but within seconds he shouts, "Everyone out, now!" Moments later, the floor collapses. Later, he can't explain exactly why he knew. He just felt it. That's expert intuition at work. In Chapter 21, Kahneman asks, when can we trust intuition, and when should we doubt it? It's tempting to think all gut feelings are unreliable. After all, we've just seen how confidence often exceeds accuracy. But Kahneman reminds us it's not that simple. Sometimes, intuition really is a form of skill. Chess masters can glance at a board and instantly see the best moves. Nurses can spot a patient in trouble before the monitors beep. Firefighters can sense danger without analyzing every detail. So what makes these intuitions trustworthy? Kahneman offers two conditions: a regular, predictable environment. The world must have patterns that can be learned. Chess, medicine, firefighting, all provide consistent cues that experts can absorb. Lots of practice with rapid feedback. Experts must get repeated chances to test their judgments and learn from results. That feedback hones intuition over time. Where those conditions exist, intuition can be astonishingly accurate. But where they don't, intuition often collapses into overconfidence. Think about stock picking. The market is chaotic, driven by countless unpredictable factors. There are no stable patterns, no consistent feedback loops. Yet investors still trust their gut and fail to beat the market. Or consider political forecasting. The environment is too messy, feedback is too slow, and the future too complex. Intuition in these fields is unreliable, no matter how confident it feels. I've seen both sides of this in my own life. When I was learning to cook, my early intuition was terrible. I thought adding more spice would always make a dish better. Wrong. But after years of practice, tasting, adjusting, I started to develop real instincts. I could tell by smell when onions were about to burn, or by texture when pasta was ready. That was intuition shaped by feedback, not just guesswork. On the flip side, I once tried to intuit which tech startups would succeed based on flashy presentations. My gut told me stories, but most of them failed. The environment was too unpredictable, and my feedback too slow. My confidence was high, my accuracy abysmal. Kahneman emphasizes that we should be skeptical of experts who can't point to regular environments and clear feedback. A seasoned firefighter? Trust him. A seasoned financial analyst claiming to predict next year's market? Be cautious. Confidence alone is not proof of validity. Another key point is that intuition often feels magical, but it's usually built on patterns we can't articulate. A doctor might just know something is wrong because they noticed subtle changes in a patient's breathing, posture, or color, cues they aren't consciously tracking. Their mind has learned to connect those dots through experience. But System 1, which produces intuition, doesn't signal whether it's reliable or not. A hunch in chess feels the same as a hunch in investing. That's the danger. We can't easily tell when our gut is grounded in real skill and when it's just a convincing illusion. For me, the lesson of Chapter 21 is balance. Don't blindly worship intuition, but don't dismiss it either. Ask, does this field have stable patterns? Do I, or does this expert, have long practice with good feedback? If the answer is yes, intuition might deserve trust. If not, it's safer to rely on data, formulas, or structured reasoning. This also changes how I view my own gut feelings. When I sense something strongly, I pause and ask, where did this intuition come from? Is it grounded in real experience, or just a story I'm telling myself? That pause can be the difference between wisdom and folly. Chapter 21 shows us that intuition is not a mystical power. It's recognition. In the right conditions, it's a powerful ally. In the wrong conditions, it's a seductive liar. The challenge is knowing which is which. So the next time you feel a hunch, whether about a chess move, a business decision, or a relationship, don't just ask, do I feel confident? Ask, does this environment reward intuition? Have I earned the experience to trust it? Because the line between expert instinct and dangerous illusion isn't how it feels. It's where it comes from. Chapter 22. Picture a seasoned stockbroker sitting at his desk. Screens glow with charts and numbers. He's been in the market for 30 years, and he leans back with confidence. I know a winner when I see one. He believes his intuition is sharp, honed by decades of experience. But Kahneman asks, should we trust him? In Chapter 22, the focus is on expert intuition, when it's reliable, and when it's nothing more than an illusion dressed up as confidence. We just learned in the last chapter that intuition can be real when two conditions are met: a regular environment with patterns and fast, clear feedback. Think firefighters, nurses, chess masters. But what about stockbrokers, political pundits, or economic forecasters? Their worlds are noisy, chaotic, and full of randomness. There are no stable patterns to learn from, and feedback is murky at best. Kahneman tells us bluntly, in those domains, expert intuition is mostly unreliable, yet experts in such fields still feel supremely confident. Why? Because their brains trick them. Every success gets remembered, every failure rationalized, and stories get woven into convincing narratives. Confidence swells even when accuracy doesn't. He points to research on professional stock traders. Many of them believe their track records show real skill, but when their portfolios are analyzed, most perform no better than chance. Their results look almost indistinguishable from random picks. And yet, they continue to feel confident, because confidence doesn't come from accuracy. It comes from the coherence of the story they tell themselves. I've seen this pattern in everyday life too. A manager convinced she can spot talent in a 5-minute interview. A coach sure he can predict which players will shine. Sometimes they're right, but more often, their skill is little more than guesswork made persuasive by confidence. Here's the hard truth Kahneman delivers. Expertise without a regular environment and rapid feedback is unreliable. It doesn't matter how much experience someone has. If the field is unpredictable, their intuition will not improve. 30 years of guessing in a noisy system doesn't create wisdom. It just creates overconfidence. But that doesn't mean all intuition is worthless. Kahneman acknowledges domains where expert judgment shines. Firefighting, chess, medicine in stable cases. Here, patterns repeat, and feedback trains the mind. In these fields, intuition is often faster and more accurate than deliberate reasoning. The problem is that System 1, the fast-thinking mind, doesn't label which kind of intuition you're having. A hunch in chess feels just like a hunch in the stock market. Your gut doesn't say, this one is grounded in years of valid feedback. This one is just noise. It just says, trust me. And we do. This is where humility matters. The best experts, Kahneman says, are those who know the limits of their intuition. They ask, am I in a predictable environment? Do I get feedback that actually teaches me? If the answer is no, then the wise expert tempers confidence with caution. Personally, I think about times when I've trusted my gut in chaotic domains, predicting which social media post would go viral, guessing which new technology would succeed. My confidence felt high, but my accuracy was hit or miss at best. In hindsight, Kahneman's point is obvious. My environment was too noisy, my feedback too slow. I wasn't learning patterns, I was just fooling myself. Kahneman also reminds us that intuition isn't useless in these messy fields. It can still provide quick starting points, but it should be checked, disciplined by data and structured analysis. A good doctor doesn't just rely on a hunch, she tests it against evidence. A good manager doesn't just trust first impressions, he backs them with performance metrics. So the big lesson of Chapter 22 is not to throw intuition away, but to treat it with respect and skepticism. Ask, is this the kind of domain where intuition earns its stripes, or the kind where it masquerades as wisdom? I find this both humbling and liberating. Humbling, because it reminds me my gut isn't always as sharp as I think. Liberating, because it frees me from having to trust every confident voice, whether my own or someone else's. I can ask, does this intuition come from a world of stable patterns and feedback, or from noise dressed up as certainty? Chapter 22 reminds us that confidence is not proof of validity, and intuition is not always expertise. The world is full of people who just know, but unless they're in the right kind of environment, what they know may be nothing more than an illusion. Chapter 23. Think back to a shocking news event, an election upset, a company suddenly collapsing, a sports team pulling off an impossible victory. In the moment, it felt surprising, almost unbelievable. But afterward? Suddenly, everyone had an explanation. Commentators nodded sagely. The signs were there all along. Friends said, I knew this would happen. The story became neat, coherent, almost inevitable. This is the hindsight bias, what Kahneman calls the I knew it all along effect. In Chapter 23, he shows how our minds rewrite the past to make it feel more predictable than it was. Here's how it works. When an outcome becomes known, we quickly build a story to explain it. And once that story feels smooth, we forget how uncertain we felt before. The surprise fades, replaced by the illusion of inevitability. Take the fall of the Soviet Union. Few experts predicted it when it was coming, but once it happened, countless analyses framed it as obvious. The economy was unsustainable, the political cracks were widening, the people were restless. In hindsight, it all made sense. But at the time, it was one possible future among many. I've felt this in my own life. I once applied for a role I was sure I'd get. When I didn't, I told myself, of course I failed. The interview was flat. The hiring manager seemed distracted. Yet before the result, I wasn't nearly so certain. Hindsight tricked me, smoothing uncertainty into inevitability. Kahneman warns that hindsight bias is more than a curiosity. It shapes how we learn, or fail to learn, from experience. If we believe outcomes were predictable all along, we underestimate how much luck, randomness, and complexity were at play. We grow overconfident in our ability to forecast, forgetting that the future is always foggier than the past appears. This bias also affects how we judge others. When a business collapses, we say the CEO was reckless. When a military campaign fails, we blame the generals. But before the outcome, those same decisions may have looked reasonable. Hindsight makes failure seem obvious, so we're harsher in our judgments. It even shapes how we evaluate success. A company that strikes gold is praised for genius leadership, bold strategy, perfect timing. But often, those same qualities appear in companies that failed. We just don't notice them because their stories aren't told. Success seems inevitable only because we're looking backward. Personally, this makes me pause when I find myself saying, I should have known. Should I really? Or am I just falling into hindsight bias? The truth is, many outcomes I label obvious today felt anything but at the time. Kahneman's research shows that hindsight bias is powerful because it feeds our craving for stories. System 1 loves coherence. Once we know the ending, we edit the beginning to fit neatly. The messy uncertainty disappears, and we trick ourselves into thinking we understand more than we did. This has real consequences. Policymakers, investors, leaders, if they underestimate uncertainty because of hindsight bias, they become overconfident in their predictions. They take risks, convinced they know how things will turn out. But the future doesn't play by hindsight's rules. It's always uncertain. What fascinates me is how hindsight bias also affects memory. Studies show that when people are told an outcome, they misremember their earlier predictions as being closer to the truth. They genuinely believe they saw it coming, even when they didn't. Memory itself gets rewritten. So what's the lesson? For me, it's humility. When I look back, I try to remind myself, it wasn't as obvious then as it feels now. That pause helps me avoid beating myself up for not predicting the future, or unfairly blaming others for missing the signs. Kahneman suggests one practical defense. Keep records of your predictions. Write down what you actually thought would happen before the outcome is known. That way, when hindsight tempts you to say, I knew it, you'll have proof of how uncertain you really were. Chapter 23 leaves us with a sobering truth. The past feels clearer than it was, and the future feels clearer than it is. Our minds love stories, but those stories are smoother than reality. If we want to make wiser decisions, we need to embrace uncertainty, not rewrite it away. The next time you hear someone say, I saw it coming, remember, they're probably not lying. Their memory has been reshaped by hindsight, and so has yours. Chapter 24. Picture a group of entrepreneurs around a coffee table. They're sketching ideas on napkins, their eyes shining with excitement. Each one believes their startup is destined to succeed. They've read the stats. Most new businesses fail within a few years, but somehow, they're sure they will be the exception. This is what Kahneman unpacks in Chapter 24. The illusion of control and our deep-seated optimism bias. Humans are natural optimists. We underestimate risks, overestimate our abilities, and believe the future will bend in our favor. It's part of why we take risks at all, why we start companies, launch projects, or even step into relationships. Without optimism, the world might grind to a halt. But optimism also blinds us. Take entrepreneurs. Studies show that 4 out of 5 small businesses fail within 5 years. Yet when founders are asked, most believe they have better odds than average. Their confidence isn't grounded in statistics. It's fueled by personal conviction. Other people fail, sure, but not me. I've felt this bias in my own projects. Before starting something new, I picture success so vividly that setbacks barely register. I tell myself I'll work harder, plan smarter, push further. but I rarely pause to consider the countless external factors beyond my control: competition, timing, sheer luck. My optimism edits them out of the story. Kahneman calls this the planning fallacy. We underestimate how long tasks will take, how much they'll cost, and how many problems will arise. Ask people how long it will take to finish a report, renovate a kitchen, or write a book, and their estimates are almost always too short. They imagine the smooth path, not the detours. This fallacy is everywhere. Governments underestimate the costs of infrastructure projects. Companies underestimate the time to launch new products. Students underestimate how long essays will take. Optimism leads us to focus on best-case scenarios, ignoring history's lessons. Kahneman himself admits he fell for it. While writing his textbook on judgment and decision-making, he and his team estimated 2 years. It took nearly a decade. Even experts in bias aren't immune to it. What fascinates me here is how optimism and the illusion of control go hand in hand. We don't just believe good things will happen. We believe we can make them happen. We treat randomness as if it bends to effort. Gamblers roll dice harder when they want higher numbers, as though force can influence chance. Investors believe their skill, not luck, drives returns. Managers think their choices dictate outcomes, even in chaotic markets. I've caught myself doing this with deadlines. When I set a target date, I convince myself that sheer willpower will keep me on track. Yet delays inevitably creep in. Unexpected requests, distractions, small crises. Still, each time I think, this time will be different. That's optimism bias in action. Kahneman doesn't say optimism is all bad. In fact, he admits it fuels progress. If every entrepreneur truly believed their odds of failure, few would ever try. Optimism gives us courage to take leaps that sometimes lead to great breakthroughs, but unchecked, it leads to wasted resources, shattered expectations, and painful miscalculations. So what can we do? Kahneman suggests something called the outside view. Instead of relying on your gut, ask, how have similar projects gone in the past? What does the data say about average outcomes? If most projects of this kind take twice as long as planned, assume yours might too. If most startups fail, acknowledge you're not magically exempt. For me, this has become a habit. When planning a project, I first list my optimistic timeline. Then I ask, if I were advising a friend, knowing what I know about similar projects, what would I tell them? That shift from inside view to outside view helps ground my optimism in reality. Chapter 24 leaves us with a humbling message. Optimism is powerful, but it can be blinding. We feel in control of more than we actually are. We believe we'll beat the odds, even when the odds crush most people. The illusion of control makes the world feel manageable, but it can also lead us into costly mistakes. The trick isn't to kill optimism, it's to balance it. Dream boldly, but plan cautiously. Imagine success, but prepare for setbacks. Because the future, no matter how confident we feel, is always more uncertain than our stories allow. Chapter 25. Imagine walking down Wall Street. Towering buildings, flashing tickers, traders shouting into phones. Billions of dollars move every minute. Now ask yourself, what fuels this massive machine? Sure, there's data, analysis, and strategy, but Kahneman argues in Chapter 25 that the true engine of capitalism is something more psychological: optimism. At its heart, capitalism thrives because people believe their ventures will succeed, even when the odds are against them. Entrepreneurs pour savings into startups, convinced they'll beat the statistics. Investors bet on new technologies, believing they've found the next big thing. Employees leave stable jobs to chase risky opportunities. None of this would happen without optimism. But here's the catch. While optimism drives growth, it also drives failure. Kahneman points out that most new businesses collapse within a few years. Most ambitious projects run over budget or underperform. Yet people keep trying. Why? Because they're sure they'll be the exception. Optimism bias keeps the wheel turning. I've seen this in friends who launched startups. Each one acknowledged the high failure rate in theory, but in practice they believed their idea was unique, their passion unstoppable. Some succeeded, many didn't. But without that optimism, none would have tried at all. This paradox fascinates me. Optimism is irrational at the individual level. It blinds people to risks and leads many to fail. But at the societal level, it's essential. Without millions of optimistic dreamers, we wouldn't have new businesses, new inventions, new industries. Progress depends on people underestimating risks. Kahneman gives the example of major infrastructure projects. Think of bridges, tunnels, or Olympic stadiums. Almost always they cost far more and take far longer than planned. Yet politicians and planners keep green-lighting them, buoyed by optimism. From a rational standpoint, this is a disaster. From a broader view, it's how societies build. If every project waited until risks were fully acknowledged, many would never start. I think about this whenever I read about ambitious ventures like space exploration or clean energy megaprojects. The odds of success are slim, the costs astronomical. But optimism pushes them forward. Some will fail, but others will change the world. There's also a darker side. Optimism feeds bubbles, financial, real estate, tech. Investors convince themselves prices will rise forever. Banks believe their models protect them. Ordinary people borrow, trusting the future will be kinder than the past. Eventually, reality intrudes. The bubble bursts. Yet after a while, optimism returns, and the cycle starts again. What strikes me is how optimism isn't evenly distributed. Entrepreneurs, investors, politicians, they need it most, because their roles demand risk-taking. Society, in some ways, outsources optimism to these groups. They drive forward with boldness, while the rest of us reap both the benefits and the costs of their gambles. For me, Chapter 25 reframes optimism. It's not just a personal quirk, it's a systemic force. It explains why economies grow, why industries rise, why societies progress. But it also explains why projects collapse, fortunes vanish, and dreams fail. Optimism is both the fuel and the fire. Kahneman doesn't suggest we eliminate optimism. We couldn't if we tried. Instead, he urges awareness. For individuals, recognizing optimism bias can prevent reckless choices. For policymakers, acknowledging the planning fallacy can temper unrealistic promises. For investors, remembering how bubbles form can guard against ruin. Personally, I try to hold two truths at once. First, optimism is what makes life exciting, what drives me to create and take risks. Second, optimism is a trickster, whispering that I'm special, that the odds don't apply to me. When I plan something new, I remind myself, dream big, but check the statistics. Believe in your vision, but respect the odds. Chapter 25 leaves us with a humbling paradox. Optimism blinds us, yet we need it. It leads individuals into failure, but society into progress. Capitalism is powered less by cold rationality than by warm confidence, by millions of people saying, it will work, even when the odds say otherwise. So the next time you see a bold new venture, remember, it might fail, it might succeed. But either way, optimism is what made it possible. And that relentless belief in possibility, that refusal to bow to the odds, is what keeps the engine of capitalism running. Chapter 26. Picture a young entrepreneur with a brilliant idea. She's convinced her startup will dominate the market. Her product is sleek, her pitch polished, her investors excited. She knows there will be challenges, of course, but in her mind, she has the edge. What she underestimates, like so many before her, is competition. This is the focus of Chapter 26, Competition Neglect. Kahneman explains that when people plan ventures, whether a new business, a career move, or even writing a book, they focus heavily on their own strengths, resources, and strategies. What they fail to consider seriously enough is the sheer force of competition. Other people are out there with similar dreams, fighting for the same customers, attention, or success. Take restaurants. New owners often believe their unique menu, passion for food, or great location will guarantee success. What they don't see clearly is the crowd of other restaurants nearby, each with their own unique twist. The failure rate for new restaurants is high not because owners lack talent, but because competition is merciless. I've seen this firsthand. A friend opened a boutique shop, confident she'd stand out. But soon, bigger brands and online retailers undercut her prices. Despite her dedication, the business closed. She hadn't ignored effort. She had ignored competition. Kahneman ties this back to optimism bias. Entrepreneurs don't just underestimate risks in general, they specifically underestimate how hard it is to outcompete others. They imagine smooth paths, as though the market is empty, waiting for them. But markets are full of rivals, many just as smart, just as driven, just as determined. This is why forecasts for new projects are so often overly rosy. Business plans brim with confidence. We'll capture 10% of the market in 5 years. Investors nod, seduced by the story. Rarely does anyone stop to ask, if it's that easy, why won't dozens of others try the same thing? The truth, Kahneman says, is that competition is a brutal equalizer. Even good ideas often fail, not because they're bad, but because others chase them too. It's not enough to be skilled. You must also outlast and outmaneuver countless competitors. What fascinates me is how blind we are to this. Even when we know markets are crowded, we still think, I'll be the one to break through. This isn't stupidity, it's human psychology. Optimism and competition neglect walk hand in hand. They're what push us to take risks we otherwise wouldn't. But there's a cost. Kahneman shares examples from large-scale projects, airports, stadiums, public infrastructure. Officials consistently underestimate costs and timelines because they neglect the competition for resources, attention, and contracts. Every project assumes it will go smoothly, but all projects are fighting over the same pool of workers, equipment, and funding. I think about this in smaller ways too. When I schedule my time, I often forget that my projects are competing with each other. I plan to write, exercise, and meet friends all in one day, as if each task exists in isolation. Then reality hits. They clash, they overlap, they compete. I underestimated competition within my own schedule. So what can we do? Kahneman suggests the outside view again. Instead of asking, what makes my plan special? Ask, how have similar efforts fared in the past? If most startups in your industry fail, assume your odds aren't magically better. If most construction projects run late, plan for delays. The outside view forces us to see competition as part of the picture, not as an afterthought. For me, the lesson is humbling, but useful. When I feel confident about a new venture, I try to ask, who else is trying the same thing? How strong are they? What will stop them from beating me? It doesn't kill my optimism, but it grounds it. Chapter 26 closes Part 3 with a sobering reminder. Overconfidence isn't just about underestimating risks or overrating skill. It's about forgetting we're not alone. Everyone is striving, competing, pushing, and in that crowded arena, success is much harder than our stories suggest. So the next time you hear someone say, we'll capture 10% of the market, pause. Ask yourself, and who else is fighting for that same 10%? Because in the real world, competition never rests, and it rarely neglects us, even when we neglect it. Part 4. Choices, Chapter 27. Imagine you're offered a gamble. Flip a coin. If it lands heads, you win $150. If tails, you lose $100. Would you take it? Most people say no. Losing $100 feels worse than gaining $150 feels good. That gut reaction reveals one of Kahneman's most famous ideas, explored in Chapter 27, prospect theory and the principle of loss aversion. Prospect theory was Kahneman and Tversky's revolutionary alternative to the classic model of human decision-making. Economists once believed people act rationally, maximizing expected utility. But in real life, people don't weigh gains and losses equally. Losses hurt about twice as much as gains of the same size bring joy. Think about finding $20 in your pocket. It's a nice little thrill. Now think about losing $20 unexpectedly. It stings more. This asymmetry shapes countless choices we make, from gambling to investing to everyday spending. I've felt this bias in my own life. Once, I sold an item online for less than I paid, even though I rarely used it. Rationally, I should have been happy to have some money back. But emotionally, The loss, compared to the original price, gnawed at me. I wasn't evaluating the present gain. I was anchored to the past cost. Kahneman explains that prospect theory maps how we value outcomes not in absolute terms, but relative to a reference point. That point might be the status quo, or an expectation, or even a price we paid. Gains feel good above it. Losses feel terrible below it. This explains why people reject fair gambles. A 50-50 chance to win $150 or lose $100 is mathematically favorable. The expected value is positive. But because the pain of losing outweighs the pleasure of winning, most people walk away. It also explains behaviors like selling winning stocks too early, locking in gains to savor them, while holding on to losing stocks too long, refusing to accept the pain of loss. Investors aren't maximizing wealth, they're minimizing regret. Kahneman illustrates how loss aversion affects negotiations. A pay cut feels unbearable, while a raise of the same size brings only modest joy. That's why workers resist wage cuts fiercely, even in recessions. Employers, aware of this, are often forced to lay people off instead, because spreading small losses evenly feels worse than imposing larger ones on a few. I find this fascinating in everyday contexts. Consider shopping. If an item is on sale from $100 to $70, it feels like a gain, even if the item was never really worth $100. The original price sets a reference point, framing the discount as a victory. Marketers exploit our sensitivity to loss and gain constantly. Prospect theory also reshapes how we think about risk. People are risk-averse when it comes to gains, preferring a sure $100 over a 50% chance at $200. But risk-seeking when facing losses, preferring a 50% chance of losing $200 over a sure loss of $100. We cling to hope when threatened by loss, even when it's irrational. I once watched a friend at a casino lose steadily at blackjack. Instead of walking away, he doubled his bets, hoping to recover. Rationally, he was digging deeper into risk. Emotionally, he was desperate to avoid locking in loss. His behavior wasn't about maximizing wealth, it was about escaping pain. This chapter, for me, is one of the most eye-opening. It explains so much of human behavior that seems irrational, but is deeply human. We don't weigh outcomes like calculators, we feel them. And losses dominate our feelings. Kahneman's prospect theory has been called one of the most important contributions to behavioral economics because it explains why real people behave differently from the rational agents in textbooks. It shows why markets swing, why negotiations stall, why insurance sells, why lotteries thrive. All are shaped by our lopsided perception of gains and losses. So what's the takeaway? For me, it's twofold. First, be aware of loss aversion in my own decisions. When I'm hesitating, I ask, am I rejecting this because it's truly bad, or just because I fear loss more than I value gain? Second, recognize how others feel the same bias. In negotiation, offering a way to avoid loss may be more persuasive than promising gain. Chapter 27 opens Part 4 with a humbling insight. We are not rational maximizers of wealth. We are creatures haunted by losses, pulled by reference points, swayed by emotion. And until we learn to see that, our choices will keep surprising us, even when they shouldn't. Chapter 28. Imagine you're given a choice. Option A, a sure gain of $900. Option B, a 90% chance to win $1,000, but a 10% chance to win nothing. Which would you choose? Most people take the sure $900. Now flip the scenario. Option A, a sure loss of $900. Option B, a 90% chance to lose $1,000, but a 10% chance to lose nothing. Suddenly, most people gamble. Why? The math is the same in both cases, but the psychology isn't. This is what Kahneman explores in Chapter 28, the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes revealed by prospect theory. Here's the pattern. High probability of gain, risk-averse. We prefer a sure win over a gamble, even if the gamble has higher expected value. That's why people take $900 for sure instead of risking for $1,000. High probability of loss, Risk-seeking. We prefer to gamble to avoid a sure loss, even when the gamble is worse mathematically. That's why people risk losing $1,000 instead of accepting a certain $900 loss. Low probability of gain. Risk-seeking. We love long shots, like lotteries. A tiny chance at a big gain excites us far more than a small, sure gain. Low probability of loss. Risk-averse. We overpay to eliminate tiny risks, like buying insurance against rare disasters. Put together, this fourfold pattern explains a huge swath of human behavior that classical economics can't. Think about lotteries. Rationally, they're terrible bets. The odds are microscopic, and the expected value is negative. Yet millions play, thrilled by the dream of a big win. That's the third quadrant, risk-seeking when the probability of gain is small. Now think about insurance. Rationally, paying extra for extended warranties or flight insurance rarely makes sense, but people do it to eliminate even tiny risks. That's the fourth quadrant, risk-averse when the probability of loss is small. I can see myself in both quadrants. I've bought raffle tickets for improbable prizes, even knowing the odds were slim. And I've paid for travel insurance on flights just for peace of mind. Logically inconsistent? Absolutely. Psychologically consistent? Completely. What fascinates me is how emotions drive this pattern. With high probability gains, the fear of disappointment pushes us to lock in a sure win. With high probability losses, the hope of escape tempts us to gamble. With small chances, we're swayed by vivid imagination, the dream of winning big or the nightmare of disaster. Kahneman points out that this explains the paradox of people buying both lottery tickets and insurance. On the surface, it's contradictory, seeking risk in one case, avoiding it in another. But under prospect theory, it makes perfect sense. Both behaviors stem from the same fourfold pattern. This also sheds light on markets. Investors sometimes cling to losing stocks, gambling on a rebound instead of cutting losses. At the same time, they sell winners too early, eager to secure gains. Both moves feel right emotionally, but both can be costly in the long run. I remember a friend who once bought cryptocurrency during a boom. When it soared, he sold quickly, afraid to lose the gains. But when the market fell, he held his losses, insisting it might bounce back. He ended up missing more upside and absorbing more downside, all because the fourfold pattern was steering him. The lesson here is humbling. Our attitudes toward risk aren't consistent. They depend on how choices are framed, on whether outcomes feel like gains or losses, and on the probabilities involved. For me, Chapter 28 is a reminder to pause when faced with risk. If I'm about to lock in a sure gain, I ask, am I being too cautious? If I'm clinging to a sure loss, I ask, am I gambling out of denial? And when I'm tempted by lotteries or insurance, I ask, am I paying for feelings, not outcomes? Kahneman doesn't say we should never indulge these biases. Sometimes the peace of mind from insurance or the fun of a lottery ticket is worth the price. But he does urge us to see the pattern clearly, so we know when emotion, not logic, is in the driver's seat. Chapter 28 deepens prospect theory, showing how our choices bend and twist depending on probability and framing. We're not consistent calculators. We're human beings, swayed by fear, hope, disappointment, and relief. So the next time you find yourself saying, I'll take the sure win, or I'll take the gamble to avoid loss, remember, you're not alone. You're following the fourfold dance of human psychology, a dance that makes us wonderfully, maddeningly predictable. Chapter 29. Imagine you're offered two gambles. In the first, you have a 95% chance to win $10,000. In the second, you have a 100% chance to win $9,000. Which do you choose? Most people pick the sure $9,000. That extra 5% of uncertainty looms large, even though the risky gamble is slightly better in expected value. Now flip it. Imagine you have a 5% chance to win $10,000 versus a 0% chance. Suddenly, people get excited about the tiny probability, buying lottery tickets, dreaming of windfalls. This is the heart of Chapter 29, the certainty effect and the possibility effect. Kahneman explains that we don't treat probabilities linearly. A jump from 95% to 100% feels huge, more than the math justifies. That's the certainty effect. We crave absolute security, even when near certainty is almost as good. On the other hand, a jump from 0% to 5% also feels huge. That's the possibility effect. We get dazzled by small chances, even when they're objectively slim. Think about insurance. If you're told there's a 95% chance a shipment will arrive safely, that 5% risk feels unsettling. Paying extra for insurance that bumps your safety to 100% feels worth it, even though the actual improvement is tiny. That's the certainty effect in action. Now think about lotteries. A 0% chance of winning means no hope, but raise it to 1% or even 0.001%, and suddenly people are willing to pay for tickets. The excitement of possibility overwhelms the low odds. That's the possibility effect. I've fallen for both. I once bought extended warranty insurance on a gadget, even though the odds of it breaking were slim. The peace of certainty felt worth the cost. And yes, I've also bought raffle tickets for improbable prizes, knowing the odds were awful, but enjoying the thrill of possibility. Kahneman points out that these effects distort how we see risk. Rationally, a 95% chance of winning should be nearly as comforting as 100%, but emotionally, it's not. Rationally, a 1% chance of winning shouldn't be that thrilling, but emotionally, it feels like a real shot. This explains why people overpay for both lotteries and insurance. Lotteries exploit the possibility effect. Insurance exploits the certainty effect. And together, they show how the psychology of risk is anything but rational. One fascinating insight here is how the certainty effect explains why negotiations often stall. People facing a sure loss fight much harder than those facing a likely but not certain loss. Taking away certainty feels disproportionately painful. It also sheds light on why governments and companies sometimes overspend to eliminate tiny risks completely. Think of billion-dollar efforts to prevent extremely rare disasters, while ignoring more probable dangers. The craving for certainty pushes resources toward the wrong places. For me, this chapter is a reminder that my feelings about probability aren't reliable guides. When I think, I need this to be 100% safe, I ask myself, would 95% safety really be so different? And when I get excited about a slim chance, I ask, am I valuing possibility more than probability? Kahneman doesn't suggest we can escape these biases entirely. They're too deeply rooted, but he does suggest we can recognize them, and sometimes use them wisely. Buying a lottery ticket, for example, isn't rational financially, but it can be rational emotionally if the dream gives you joy. Buying insurance may not maximize wealth, but it may maximize peace of mind. The key is knowing when you're paying for math and when you're paying for feelings. Chapter 29 shows us that certainty and possibility distort our choices more than we realize. We chase the comfort of 100%, even when 95% is nearly the same. We chase the thrill of 5%, even when it's barely more than 0. These quirks make us human, but they also make us predictable and exploitable. So the next time you're tempted by a guaranteed outcome or a tiny chance at glory, pause. Ask yourself, am I seeing probability clearly, or am I under the spell of certainty or possibility? Because in the end, our feelings about risk aren't about numbers. They're about the stories we tell ourselves, and those stories are far more powerful than percentages on a page. Chapter 30. Picture two friends at a convenience store. One buys a lottery ticket, grinning at the fantasy of instant riches. The other buys travel insurance for an upcoming trip, relieved at the thought of, no matter what happens, I'm covered. At first glance, their behaviors seem opposite. One chasing risk, the other avoiding it. But Kahneman shows us in Chapter 30 that both spring from the same source, prospect theory at work. This chapter takes all the ideas we've built, loss aversion, the fourfold pattern of risk, the certainty effect, the possibility effect, and shows how they shape real-world choices. Let's start with lotteries. Rationally, lotteries are a terrible deal. The odds are minuscule, the expected value negative, yet millions play. Why? Because of the possibility effect. That tiny chance feels intoxicating. Even a 1 in a million shot at wealth sparks imagination. Buying a ticket isn't about math, it's about buying a dream. Now flip it. Why do people overpay for insurance? Because of the certainty effect. Eliminating even a small risk of loss feels disproportionately valuable. People buy extended warranties, flight insurance, even peace of mind add-ons that make little financial sense. Again, it's not about math, it's about emotions. I remember once paying extra for phone insurance. Over the years, I spent far more on premiums than I would have on one replacement. But at the time, the thought of a broken phone with no backup plan felt unbearable. Certainty had a price, and I paid it gladly. Kahneman highlights how these biases explain behaviors that traditional economics struggled with. Classic theory assumed people were rational utility maximizers. If insurance was overpriced, rational people wouldn't buy it. If lotteries had negative value, rational people wouldn't play. But people aren't calculators. They're storytellers, pulled by hope and fear. Prospect theory bridges that gap. It explains why we make choices that look irrational but feel perfectly human. Another application is in public policy. Governments use lotteries to raise funds because they know people overvalue small chances. They also design insurance schemes, knowing people will overpay to eliminate small risks. In both cases, policymakers rely on the predictable quirks of human psychology. I find this both fascinating and a little unsettling. On one hand, it's brilliant, understanding real behavior instead of pretending we're rational robots. On the other, it shows how easily our biases can be exploited. Lotteries often take money from the poor, who can least afford it, while selling them dreams of escape. Insurance companies thrive because people fear rare risks more than they value common ones. Kahneman also points out how prospect theory changes negotiation and pricing. Framing outcomes as losses or gains shifts choices dramatically. A $100 discount sounds nice, but avoiding a $100 surcharge feels even better. People fight harder to avoid loss than to secure gain. Smart marketers and negotiators use this instinct every day. Personally, I've noticed this at the grocery store. When a label says, "Save $2, I feel mildly pleased. But when it says, "Don't pay $2 extra, I feel almost compelled to act. Same math, different framing, different emotional weight. Another striking insight from this chapter is how prospect theory reshapes our view of fairness. People tolerate price increases when costs rise, but see identical increases as unfair if driven by profit. Loss aversion explains this. We interpret the same outcome differently depending on whether it feels like a loss or a justified adjustment. The lesson of Chapter 30 for me is that prospect theory isn't just academic, it's everywhere. In every lottery ticket sold, every insurance policy offered, every pricing trick at the store. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So what do we do with this knowledge? Kahneman doesn't say we should stop buying insurance or never play the lottery. Instead, he urges awareness. If you buy a lottery ticket, admit you're buying a fantasy, not an investment. If you buy insurance, admit you're buying peace of mind, not just financial value. By naming the bias, you reclaim some power over it. For me, the takeaway is simple. My choices are not just about numbers, they're about feelings. And those feelings, while real, can mislead me. If I pause to ask, am I reacting to probability or to the illusion of certainty, possibility? I can make choices with clearer eyes. Chapter 30 shows prospect theory in action, not just in theory. It reveals how our quirks shape entire industries, influence policies, and guide everyday decisions. And it leaves us with a humbling reminder. We may never be fully rational, but we can at least be aware of the stories our minds are telling when we choose. Chapter 31. Imagine this. You're a doctor speaking to a patient. You have to explain the risks of a surgery. If you say, "There's a 90% chance of survival," the patient nods, reassured. But if you say, "There's a 10% chance of death," the very same patient freezes in fear. The numbers are identical, but the feelings they evoke are worlds apart. This is the essence of framing, the focus of Chapter 31. Kahneman shows us that the way choices are presented, framed, shapes decisions more than the actual facts. We like to think we choose based on logic, but often we're choosing based on language, on perspective, on whether something feels like a gain or a loss. Take the famous Asian disease problem. Participants were told a deadly disease was expected to kill 600 people. They had to choose between two programs. In one version, Program A was framed as saving 200 lives, while Program B offered a 1/3 chance of saving all 600 and a 2/3 chance of saving none. In another version, Program A was framed as 400 people will die, while Program B offered the same probabilities as before. Mathematically, both scenarios were identical, but people chose differently depending on the frame. In the lives saved frame, most chose the safe option. In the people will die frame, most chose the risky gamble. Gains made us risk-averse, losses made us risk-seeking. Same math, different frame, different choices. I've seen this in my own life. A gym membership once advertised, "Save $100 by paying yearly." That sounded nice, but I hesitated. Later, the same gym advertised, "Don't lose $100 in monthly fees." Suddenly it felt urgent. Same deal, different frame. And I signed up. Framing works because of loss aversion. When something is framed as a loss, it stings more, and we're willing to take risks to avoid it. When it's framed as a gain, we prefer the sure thing. Kahneman explains that framing isn't just a marketing trick. It shapes medicine, law, and policy. Doctors know patients make different decisions depending on whether outcomes are framed as survival rates or mortality rates. Judges may rule differently if damages are framed as compensation for loss versus reward for suffering. Politicians know that framing taxes as relief versus burden can sway public opinion. It's not that people are stupid. It's that our minds are wired to respond to context. The same reality feels different depending on the story wrapped around it. What fascinates me is how framing can make us inconsistent without realizing it. We might reject one option, then accept the mathematically identical one when it's worded differently. We feel principled, but really, we're being nudged by phrasing. Personally, this makes me more cautious when making decisions. When faced with a choice, I try to reframe it myself. If an option is presented as a gain, I reword it as a loss, and vice versa. That way, I can see if my preference shifts with the frame. If it does, I know emotion is steering me more than logic. Kahneman doesn't suggest we can escape framing altogether. It's too baked into how we think. But awareness helps. If we know frames are influencing us, we can at least check whether we're reacting to reality or just to wording. This also reminds me how powerful framing is in persuasion. If I want to motivate someone, I can frame outcomes as avoiding losses rather than gaining benefits. "Don't lose your progress" is often more compelling than "keep making progress." Marketers, leaders, and negotiators use this instinctively. And now I see why it works. Chapter 31 leaves us with a humbling insight. We're not making choices in a vacuum. We're making them inside frames, stories, contexts, words that shape how we see the world. The facts may stay the same, but our feelings don't. So the next time you're making an important choice, pause, flip the frame. Ask, how would I feel if this were worded the other way? Because often, clarity isn't about changing the numbers. It's about changing the frame. Chapter 32. Imagine buying a lottery ticket. The odds are microscopic, millions to one, but still, your heart races as you picture yourself holding the winning numbers. Now imagine buying flight insurance against a rare accident. The odds are just as slim, but your heart clenches at the thought of disaster. In both cases, you're reacting not to probability, but to possibility. This is the focus of Chapter 32, how we treat rare events. Kahneman explains that we don't process small probabilities rationally. We overweight unlikely outcomes, treating them as more likely than they are. That's why people buy lottery tickets and insurance, two opposite bets on rare events. We exaggerate both the dream of a jackpot and the fear of catastrophe. Take lotteries. The chance of winning is almost zero, but the possibility glows brightly in our minds. The image of wealth is vivid, and our brains give it weight. That's why millions of people spend money on tickets with negative expected value. They're not buying probability, they're buying hope. On the flip side, think of terrorism. The odds of being killed in a terrorist attack are vanishingly small. Yet after a high-profile incident, fear surges. People change travel plans, governments spend billions, citizens demand protection. The possibility feels heavier than the probability. I remember vividly after a plane crash made headlines, a friend refused to fly for months. Statistically, Flying was still far safer than driving, but the vividness of the rare event overwhelmed the math. That's the availability heuristic meeting probability weighting. Our brains overemphasize what's dramatic, not what's likely. Kahneman points out that we don't always overweight rare events. If a rare event isn't emotionally charged, say, a tiny chance of losing a small sum, we often ignore it entirely. We act as if the probability is zero. But if the event carries strong emotion, dreams of wealth, fears of death, we treat it as far more likely than it is. This explains why people both neglect and exaggerate rare risks, depending on the context. We may ignore the small chance of a house fire, skipping insurance, yet will overpay for extended warranties against minor breakdowns. The difference isn't the math, it's the emotional vividness of the outcome. What fascinates me is how industries are built on this quirk. Lotteries thrive because people overweight tiny probabilities of gain. Insurance thrives because people overweight tiny probabilities of loss. Both play on the same distortion, just from opposite sides of the coin. Personally, I've noticed this bias in how I plan. When a project has a slim chance of massive success, I catch myself clinging to that hope, investing time disproportionate to the odds. When facing a rare but scary risk, I sometimes spend more effort preventing it than dealing with the more common problems I ignore. My brain doesn't weigh probabilities, it magnifies feelings. Kahneman also shows how this bias influences policy. After rare disasters, governments often overreact, pouring resources into preventing that specific event, even if it's unlikely to recur. Meanwhile, more probable dangers, like traffic accidents or chronic disease, get less attention. Public pressure follows emotions, not statistics. For me, the lesson of Chapter 32 is to pause and ask, am I reacting to probability or to possibility? If the odds are tiny, is my response proportional? Sometimes the answer is yes. Peace of mind matters. Sometimes it's no. I'm wasting energy on what's unlikely while neglecting what's probable. Kahneman doesn't suggest we can stop overweighting rare events. It's too deeply human. But awareness can help us calibrate. Buying a lottery ticket? Fine. But admit you're buying a fantasy, not an investment. Buying insurance? Fine. But admit you're buying peace of mind, not just expected value. Chapter 32 leaves us with a sobering truth. Our perception of risk is warped. Rare events loom larger than they should, shaping our choices, our markets, even our politics. The math fades, and the story takes over. So the next time a tiny probability dazzles or terrifies you, pause. Ask yourself, am I chasing possibility or respecting probability? Because in the end, it's not the numbers that move us, it's the images, the emotions, the dreams and fears that those numbers awaken. Chapter 33. Imagine a friend asks you, would you take a 50% chance to lose $1,000 or a sure loss of $500? You hesitate. The gamble feels terrifying, but the sure loss feels painful. You might roll the dice just to avoid admitting defeat. Now imagine the same gamble presented differently. Would you prefer a 50% chance to save $1,000 or a sure saving of $500? Suddenly, it feels like a different decision. Same math, same outcomes, but the frame shifts everything. This is where risk policies come in, the focus of Chapter 33. Kahneman argues that because our moment-to-moment decisions are inconsistent and emotional, we need broader rules, policies, that guide us more rationally over time. Here's the problem. When faced with single gambles, we're vulnerable to loss aversion, framing effects, and emotional swings. But when we step back and look at repeated decisions, the picture changes. A single coin toss feels risky. 100 coin tosses feel safe, because the law of large numbers smooths out extremes. Yet our brains struggle to see that. I've felt this bias while investing. A single bad day in the market feels unbearable. I want to sell and escape loss. But zoom out to years of returns, and the risk shrinks. Rationally, long-term investing is safer. Emotionally, each short-term dip feels catastrophic. Kahneman suggests that one way to overcome this is to adopt broad framing instead of narrow framing. Narrow framing means judging each gamble or decision in isolation. Broad framing means looking at the bigger picture, the portfolio of decisions, the long-term outcomes, the repeated game. Think about an insurance company. If it treated each policy as a separate gamble, it would panic. Any one claim could wipe it out. But by pooling thousands of policies, it sees stability. The risk is spread. Broad framing makes risk manageable. Individuals can do this too. Instead of agonizing over one investment, think of your whole portfolio. Instead of stressing over one tough choice, think of the policy you want to follow in similar situations. That shift reduces the emotional sway of single outcomes. For example, if you're deciding whether to buy extended warranties, don't just ask, "Do I want insurance for this laptop?" Ask, "Do I want insurance for every product I'll ever buy?" Broad framing often reveals that paying repeatedly for low probability protection is a losing policy. I've applied this in my own life. Instead of debating each bet, lottery ticket, insurance policy, investment, I ask what policy makes sense over dozens of similar choices. That perspective makes it easier to say no to gambles that feel tempting but don't pay off in the long run. Kahneman also points out that organizations can protect themselves from bias by setting clear policies. For instance, a company might adopt a rule. We don't invest in projects unless expected returns exceed 15%. That rule keeps them from being swayed by enthusiasm for particular ventures. Individuals can do the same. I don't buy lottery tickets. I don't chase sunk costs. Policies create consistency where emotions create chaos. What fascinates me is how much discipline this requires. System 1 lives in the moment, reacting to each gamble, each loss, each thrill. System 2 has to step in, designing policies and enforcing them. It's like building guardrails against your own psychology. But there's a payoff. Broad framing and risk policies don't just reduce losses, they reduce regret. When you follow a consistent rule, you may still lose sometimes, but you know the decision was part of a sound policy. That makes the sting easier to bear. Personally, this chapter makes me rethink how I handle risks. Instead of asking, "What feels right now?" I try to ask, "What policy would I want to follow every time?" That small shift turns emotional choices into strategic ones. Chapter 33 leaves us with a practical insight. We can't eliminate our biases, but we can outsmart them with rules. By framing decisions broadly, by thinking in terms of repeated games instead of one-off gambles, we can make choices that serve us better over time. So the next time you're stuck on a risky choice, pause. Don't just ask, "Do I want this gamble?" Ask, "What policy would I want for all similar gambles?" Because in the end, wisdom isn't about winning one toss. It's about playing the whole game well. Chapter 34. Imagine you're standing in front of two doors. Behind one, a guaranteed $500. Behind the other, a 1% chance to win $50,000. Which do you choose? For some, the certainty of $500 feels safe and comforting. For others, the tiny chance of hitting it big sparks excitement. Both choices reveal how we distort probabilities when making decisions. In Chapter 34, Kahneman ties together the threads of prospect theory, loss aversion, the fourfold pattern, the certainty effect, the possibility effect, into a fuller picture of how we actually handle risk. He calls it the prospect theory value function. Here's the gist. We don't see outcomes in absolute terms. We judge them relative to a reference point. Gains bring joy, losses bring pain, and losses loom larger than gains. But probabilities? We don't see them clearly either. We overweight small probabilities and underweight moderate and high probabilities. That's why lotteries thrive and insurance sells. The chance of winning a jackpot is tiny, but our minds inflate it. The chance of a rare disaster is tiny, but we inflate that too. Meanwhile, the difference between 60% and 70% odds hardly registers emotionally, even though mathematically it's significant. I see this bias every time I buy a raffle ticket. I know the odds are slim, but I catch myself daydreaming about winning. The emotional weight of possibility overshadows probability. On the flip side, when I buy travel insurance, I know the risk is low, but I pay anyway. The peace of mind feels worth it. Kahneman points out that this distorted weighting makes us inconsistent. We shy away from gambles with high probabilities of gain, risk-averse at the top end, but we chase gambles with low probabilities of gain, risk-seeking at the bottom. We refuse sure small losses, risk-seeking for high probability losses, yet we overpay to eliminate tiny losses, risk-averse for low probability losses. It's not logical, but it's deeply human. One striking example he gives is how people respond to medical treatments. If a drug offers a small chance of preventing a deadly disease, patients often cling to it, even if the chance is minuscule. Hope magnifies the possibility. On the other hand, if a drug almost always works but has a small chance of failure, patients may reject it. Fear magnifies the risk. Same math, different emotional weights. What fascinates me is how this plays out in public life. Politicians exploit it when framing policies. Want to pass a law? Emphasize the tiny risk it prevents. Want to sell a dream? Emphasize the tiny chance of glory. People respond not to the numbers but to the emotional punch of possibility or certainty. Personally, this chapter makes me rethink how I see risk. When I hesitate to take a good bet, I ask, am I underweighting a high probability? When I get excited about a long shot, I ask, am I overweighting a small probability? It doesn't stop the bias, but it helps me check it. Kahneman also shows how prospect theory explains why people buy both lottery tickets and insurance. At first, it looks contradictory. Why would the same person chase risk in one case and avoid it in another? But through the lens of distorted probability weighting, it makes sense. Both are emotional purchases, not rational ones. What I love about this chapter is how it reframes irrationality. We're not foolish for dreaming or fearing. We're wired that way. Our minds evolved to overreact to rare events, because in the wild, rare dangers and rare opportunities could be life or death. Modern life turns those instincts into quirks that markets and policies can exploit. The takeaway is not to suppress emotion, but to see it clearly. If I buy a lottery ticket, I admit I'm buying hope, not investment. If I buy insurance, I admit I'm buying peace of mind, not just value. And when I make big decisions, I remind myself that my gut may be bending probabilities into shapes that don't match reality. Chapter 34 wraps up Part 4 with a humbling insight. Our choices aren't guided by cold logic. They're guided by distorted perceptions of gain, loss, and probability. We are creatures of stories and emotions, not calculators of odds. So the next time you're tempted by a long shot or reassured by certainty, pause. Ask, is this about probability or possibility? About value or peace of mind? Because in the end, understanding our biases doesn't erase them, but it does give us the power to navigate them with a little more wisdom. Part 5. Two Selves, Chapter 35. Close your eyes and imagine a vacation. You're lying on a beach, warm sun on your skin, waves lapping in the distance. You feel completely at peace. Now imagine that at the end of the trip, all your photos will be deleted, your memory of the experience wiped clean, and no one will ever know you went. Would you still take the vacation? This strange thought experiment opens the door to Chapter 35, where Kahneman introduces us to the two selves inside each of us, the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives in the moment. It feels the warmth of the sun, the sweetness of dessert, the sting of disappointment. It experiences life second by second, minute by minute. The remembering self, on the other hand, is the storyteller. It looks back, weaves moments into a narrative, and decides whether an experience was good or bad. Here's the twist. The remembering self usually dominates. It's the one that keeps score, makes decisions, and tells us who we are. The experiencing self may live the moments, but the remembering self decides which moments matter. Kahneman illustrates this with a study on pain. Patients underwent a medical procedure that was uncomfortable. Some had shorter but more intense pain. Others had longer procedures with milder endings. When asked afterward, patients judged their overall experience not by the total amount of pain, but by the peak, the worst moment, and the end. A long but gentle ending left a better memory than a short, sharp finish. This became known as the peak end rule. Our remembering self doesn't tally every second. It highlights the highs and lows, especially the ending. The duration hardly matters. That's why a 2-week vacation can feel no more memorable than a 1-week vacation. The remembering self condenses the story, focusing on peaks and how it ended. I've felt this in my own life. I once attended a concert where the music was amazing, but the last 20 minutes dragged with technical issues. When I think back, that clumsy ending colors the whole night. My experiencing self had hours of joy. My remembering self carries a story of disappointment. Kahneman pushes us to realize that these two selves often want different things. The experiencing self wants pleasure, comfort, flow. The remembering self wants stories, meaning, milestones. Sometimes they align, but often they conflict. Think about students pulling all-nighters to pass exams. The experiencing self suffers, tired, stressed, unhappy. But the remembering self says, "It was worth it. I succeeded." Or think of marathons. The experiencing self feels pain, exhaustion. The remembering self later recalls pride, triumph. This conflict raises profound questions. Which self should we listen to when making decisions? If you plan a vacation, are you planning for the moments you'll live or for the memories you'll keep? Kahneman suggests that most of us, knowingly or not, plan for our remembering selves. We want stories we can tell ourselves and others. Personally, I find this idea both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling because it means I may be neglecting the actual experience of living, chasing memories instead. Liberating because it gives me a choice. Do I want to maximize moment-to-moment happiness, or do I want to build stories worth remembering? Kahneman doesn't say one self is better than the other, but he does reveal how much power the remembering self holds. It's the one that looks back and decides, that was a good life. Yet the experiencing self is the one that actually lives it. Chapter 35 leaves us with a haunting insight. We are not one self, but two. One lives, the other remembers. And while they often conflict, both shape the way we choose, the way we value, the way we understand what it means to be happy. So the next time you make a choice, whether it's about travel, work, or relationships, ask yourself, am I choosing for my experiencing self or for my remembering self? Because in the end, happiness depends not just on how life feels as we live it, but on how we tell the story afterward. Chapter 36. Picture two patients undergoing the same medical procedure. For patient A, the pain is sharp and intense, but the procedure is over quickly. For patient B, the pain is just as sharp at the start, but then lingers for longer, gradually easing before the procedure ends. Who had the worse experience? If you ask their experiencing selves, patient B clearly suffered more. The pain lasted longer. But if you ask their remembering selves, the answer flips. Patient B remembers the procedure as less awful because it ended on a softer note. Patient A remembers the intense final moments, and those dominate the story. This is the peak end rule in action, the subject of Chapter 36. Kahneman explains that our memories of experiences aren't faithful recordings. They're summaries, built from two key points: the peak, the most intense moment, good or bad, and the end. Duration, the total length of the experience, hardly matters. This is called duration neglect. Think about a vacation. Whether it lasts 1 week or 2, the memory will be shaped more by the highlights and the ending than by how many days you spent. That's why people often say, the trip was great, except the last day when the flight got canceled. And that single ending colors the whole memory. I've seen this in my own life. I once attended a wedding where the ceremony was beautiful, the food delicious, the dancing joyful. But at the end, a long, awkward delay waiting for transport soured the memory. My remembering self filed the day as frustrating, even though my experiencing self had enjoyed hours of happiness. This disconnect has big consequences. For one, it means our decisions about the future are often guided by remembered stories, not lived realities. If the memory of a vacation is shaped by highlights and endings, we may choose to repeat it, even if, in the moment, much of it was dull or stressful. Kahneman illustrates this with another experiment. Patients had the option to repeat two medical procedures, one shorter but ending painfully, the other longer but ending more gently. Rationally, the shorter procedure meant less total suffering. But most patients preferred to repeat the longer one, because their remembering selves judged it more favorably. It's unsettling when you think about it. We don't choose based on how much we actually suffer or enjoy. We choose based on how much we remember suffering or enjoying. The remembering self steers the ship, even if the experiencing self bore the weight. This raises an uncomfortable question. Whose happiness really matters? The experiencing self that lives every moment, or the remembering self that writes the story? If your experiencing self is miserable during a marathon, but your remembering self recalls it as triumphant, was it worth it? Personally, this makes me reflect on my own decisions. When I commit to difficult projects, I often endure stress and exhaustion. My experiencing self complains, but afterward, my remembering self feels proud and fulfilled. Looking back, I tell myself, that was a great experience. But was it? Or was it just a great story? Kahneman doesn't give us easy answers. He simply reveals the tension between the selves. The experiencing self cares about duration, the hours of pain or joy. The remembering self discards that, focusing on peaks and endings. And since the remembering self decides what we recall, talk about, and use to plan the future, it often has the louder voice. For me, the key lesson of Chapter 36 is to be mindful of this bias. If I'm making choices about the future, I should ask, am I optimizing for lived experience or for remembered story? Sometimes it's fine to prioritize memory. We cherish photos, milestones, proud achievements. But other times, it's worth honoring the experiencing self, seeking comfort, peace, or flow in the moment, even if it won't make a flashy memory. Chapter 36 deepens our understanding of the two selves. It shows us how memories misrepresent experiences, highlighting peaks and endings while neglecting duration. And it reminds us that the story we carry may not match the life we actually lived. So the next time you look back and say, that was a great experience, pause. Ask yourself, was it great to live or just great to remember? Because the difference matters more than we think. Chapter 37. Imagine two people asked a simple question. Are you happy with your life? One pauses, smiles, and says yes. The other frowns, hesitates, and says no. Now imagine you ask them another question. How happy do you feel right now? The answers might flip. One could be content overall but annoyed in the moment. The other could be struggling in life but enjoying the sunny afternoon. This is the puzzle of happiness that Kahneman explores in Chapter 37. Happiness, it turns out, isn't one thing. It depends on which self you ask. The experiencing self measures happiness moment by moment. Comfort, pleasure, pain, boredom, joy. The remembering self measures happiness by the story of our lives, success, meaning, fulfillment. And these two measures don't always line up. Kahneman explains that the experiencing self's happiness depends heavily on circumstances, health, noise, weather, company. Small annoyances can shrink it. Small pleasures can boost it. The remembering self, meanwhile, focuses on big narratives, career achievements, relationships, identity. It can declare a life happy even if many moments were difficult. Take parents of young children. Ask them about their daily lives, and they'll often report stress, exhaustion, lack of sleep. The experiencing self is struggling, but ask them if having children makes their lives meaningful, and they'll say absolutely. The remembering self treasures the story, even if the moment-to-moment living is hard. I've felt this divide myself. During intense projects, my experiencing self was miserable, long nights, constant pressure. But when I finished, my remembering self looked back with pride. I told myself it was a great time in my life, even though living it didn't feel great. Kahneman emphasizes that measuring happiness is tricky because researchers often confuse these two selves. Surveys that ask people to rate their life satisfaction capture the remembering self. Surveys that ask about moment-to-moment feelings capture the experiencing self. Both are valid, but they're not the same. This distinction reshapes debates about well-being. Policies that raise income, for example, often boost life satisfaction. The remembering self feels more successful. But beyond a certain threshold, they don't increase daily happiness much. The experiencing self adapts quickly. Noise, however, like living near an airport, barely affects life satisfaction, but steadily reduces daily happiness. Which measure should matter more? For me, this chapter is eye-opening. It forces me to ask, do I want a life that feels good to live, or a life that looks good in memory? Do I want comfort in the moment, or meaning in the story? Ideally, both, but often they conflict. Kahneman doesn't say one is right and the other wrong, but he warns that the remembering self dominates decision-making. It plans vacations, chooses careers, decides to have children. It seeks stories worth telling, even at the expense of moment-to-moment happiness. The experiencing self may complain, but it rarely gets the vote. This makes me wonder, how often am I sacrificing the lived quality of my days for the sake of a story? Staying late at work for achievements I'll remember but not enjoy in the moment. Choosing ambitious projects that make good narratives but drain daily joy. Maybe the balance should shift. At the same time, meaning matters. A life of pure momentary pleasure with no story of growth or purpose might feel empty. The trick is harmony, finding pursuits that satisfy both selves, a career that brings daily engagement and a meaningful story, relationships that bring joy in the moment and a cherished narrative over time. Chapter 37 leaves us with a deep, almost unsettling truth. Happiness isn't singular. It's fractured between two selves, each with its own needs, its own metrics. The experiencing self asks, how do I feel now? The remembering self asks, how is my life going? And the answers can be very different. So the next time you ask yourself, am I happy? Pause. Which self is answering? The one living the moment, or the one telling the story? The art of living may lie in listening to both. Chapter 38. Imagine standing at the end of your life, looking back. What would matter more, the thousands of moments you lived day by day, or the story you tell yourself about the life you lived? That question sits at the heart of Chapter 38, Kahneman's final reflections. Throughout the book, we've traveled with two characters, the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives every second, eating breakfast, feeling traffic stress, laughing with friends, tossing in restless sleep. The remembering self, by contrast, collects snapshots, edits them, and builds a narrative. It decides if the vacation was wonderful, if the career was successful, if the life was happy. And here's the sobering truth. When we make decisions, it's almost always the remembering self in charge. It doesn't care about every lived moment. It cares about the story. Take vacations. Kahneman asks, would you choose a trip where you felt joy every day but remembered little, or a trip where you felt frustrated most days but recalled it later as amazing? Most people pick the second. We sacrifice the experiencing self for the remembering one. The same applies to life choices. We choose careers that make impressive stories, even if the daily grind is draining. We pursue achievements that will make our remembering self proud, even if our experiencing self suffers along the way. The remembering self is a ruthless editor. It values highlights, meaning, endings. The rest is cut from the reel. I've seen this in myself. Looking back at difficult chapters, I sometimes tell the story as triumph. I grew, I achieved, I overcame. But if I'm honest, my experiencing self was miserable during much of it. The story is uplifting. The living was painful. Kahneman would say, that's the remembering self at work, rewriting life into a narrative. He reminds us that this isn't inherently bad. It's just how we are wired. The remembering self gives coherence, identity, pride. But it also blinds us to the value of simple lived moments. The average Tuesday, the small joys, the quiet peace, they matter less to memory, but they matter deeply to experience. This leads to an unsettling paradox. A happy life and a happy story may not be the same. Someone can live mostly content days but remember their life as dull. Another can live stressful, painful days but remember their life as rich and meaningful. Which is better? Kahneman doesn't give a definitive answer. Instead, he leaves us with awareness. If you want to maximize the experiencing self, focus on present comfort, flow, and daily joy. If you want to maximize the remembering self, focus on achievements, milestones, and stories. Most of us try to juggle both, but often we lean too heavily toward memory. Personally, I find this both challenging and freeing. Challenging because it forces me to admit I sometimes neglect my daily experience for the sake of stories. Freeing because it gives me permission to value the small moments more. Maybe happiness isn't just in achievements, but in the texture of everyday life, the meal, the walk, the laugh. Kahneman closes with humility. His work dismantles the myth of the rational human. We are creatures of bias, overconfidence, distorted probabilities, storytelling selves. Yet knowing these flaws doesn't make us broken. It makes us human. Awareness is our tool. By seeing the traps, hindsight, optimism, framing, loss aversion, we can step around them, or at least stumble less often. Chapter 38 isn't just an ending, it's a mirror. It asks, which self are you living for? Which self are you serving? The experiencing self, who wants peace and pleasure in the moment? Or the remembering self, who wants a story worth telling? Maybe the art of wisdom is balance. To live days that feel good as they pass, and to build stories that feel meaningful when remembered. Not one or the other, but both. And so the book ends where life begins, with choices. Not perfectly rational ones, but human ones. Choices shaped by fast and slow thinking, by peaks and endings, by fear of loss and hope of gain, by the two selves who share one life. And that wraps up our journey through thinking, fast and slow. We've uncovered how our minds leap, stumble, and tell stories about our lives, and why knowing these hidden patterns can make us just a little bit wiser. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps more people discover this content. And if you want more book summaries, life lessons, and deep dives into psychology, decision-making, and self-growth, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. I'd also love to hear from you. Which idea from Kahneman's book hit you the hardest? Was it loss aversion, the two selves, the illusion of confidence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And finally, if you know someone who always says, "I knew it all along," maybe share this video with them. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep thinking, fast and slow.